wait. If she left the Department of Education in 1982 because she feared the department was going to be, quote, abolished, unquote, why did she leave a lucrative private sector job just a year earlier to go to work in the same department? To the extent there was any risk that the Department of Education was going to be abolished, that risk was greater in 1981 than it was when she left, than in 1982. Number 9, why was she with Judge Thomas at the while she was with Judge Thomas at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission? Why did women, really strong, noble women, who worked closely with both of them and around the chairman's suite of offices, testified to the committee that they never saw any signs of distress or discomfort or irritation of the sort that you would expect in Professor Hill? Why didn't Professor Hill suggest any concerns to any of her co-workers? Number 10, why after leaving the Equal Employment Opportunity did Professor Hill continue to call Judge Thomas seeking assistance in obtaining research and leaving messages that clearly show a continued interest in cordial social professional relations with him? Number 11, why did she call him so many times? Not only the 11 times mentioned in the logs, but 4, 5, or 6 times mentioned by Miss Holt, who nobody could doubt. I've never seen a person who testified more forthrightly and more favorably to her when she had a chance with regard to their personal friendship and relationship. She was fair to her. She just doesn't believe her and said basically she knew that this did not go on. And so did the other 3. They were very powerful witnesses. Number 12. If those lurid references to a Coke can and a pornography star, if you want to use that term, occurred, why did not she use those vivid and dramatic conversations in her September 23, 1991 statement to the Judiciary Committee or in her interview with the FBI? She did not. And why is it so circumstantially interesting that one of those references was used in the 1988 case right in the very circuit in which she was teaching law school, in a very type of a case that she would have been concerned about as a civil rights expert and lawyer? And why was the other quote so vividly similar to the one in the book? Number 13, why when Clarence Thomas, years later, after she had her own job, was out from under his control, why when he visited Oral Roberts University did Professor Hill socialize with Judge Thomas? Why did she have breakfast with him? Why did she volunteer to take him to the airport? Why was she so friendly to him? The dean said she was tremendously friendly to him. Now, I don't believe that that woman that I saw there is a hypocritical person. I just don't think it makes sense that she would have treated somebody who treated her with such disdain, according to her allegations, that she would have treated him like a long-lost friend. As Dean Cothe of the Oral Roberts University asked, this is number 14, how could Professor Hill even think of suggesting Clarence Thomas speak to the university on the issue of sex harassment if she believed any of her allegations to be true? How could she? Where was her professional obligation then? Allow him to come and speak to these students, most of whom were in their 20s? Number 15, how could Professor Hill, according to 2 witnesses at this summer's ABA convention, say that it was, quote, a good thing, unquote, that Judge Thomas was being named to the Supreme Court of the United States of America? And those 2 witnesses were sure of that statement. Number 16, why, if Judge Thomas said these vile things, did Professor Hill not try to distance herself from him? You saw when Miss Fitz said that there were some vile things of a similar nature said to her, she got away from the person as quickly as she could and got another job. That was really credible testimony by Miss Fitch. I don't know about you, but I fell in love with those 4 witnesses. They were as good a witnesses as I've ever seen, and you couldn't have found witnesses in central casting for a movie that were better than those. They were wonderful, honest women, and they loved Clarence Thomas as a professional leader. Number 17, why would Judge Thomas, as an African-American male, acutely sensitive to black issues, why would he... Mr.
Senator's 20 minutes has expired.
May I have just 2 more minutes?
My show, Senator, go ahead.
I'll try to be even shorter. Why would Judge Thomas, as an African-American male who was acutely sensitive to black issues, use those anti-black stereotypes, racial stereotypes? To me, that was a dramatic part of his testimony. And he testified honestly. If you read that record and watched him, you knew he did.
Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican of Utah,
His intelligence.
winding up one more impassioned appeal on behalf of Clarence Thomas. He was not only his advocate on the Senate Judiciary Committee, but he's also his friend. This is the NBC tally as we have it so far. Just 1 vote short at this hour for Judge Thomas. The official vote comes now in about 2 hours and a half at 6 Eastern time tonight. We just heard from Senator Robert Dole, Republican leader here at the United States Senate, a man who gives you a pretty honest count in these kinds of situations, says that he expects that they'll have more than 50 votes, 52 up to as high as 56, although he conceded it may not go that high. So it does appear certain at this hour that Clarence Thomas will be confirmed for the United States Supreme Court, but we always have to wait to see what will happen on the floor of that chamber. And of course, the vote will go well beyond his ascension to the U.S. Supreme Court. It will resonate out across this country in the political year coming up, 1992, as many of these senators go back for re-election and as they begin to face the prospects of an ever more wrathful United States electorate, and especially with term limitations beginning to take hold in many states across the country. Let's go to New York now, where NBC's Faith Daniels is standing by. Faith?
Thanks, Tom. This incident has certainly gone way beyond Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. In fact, it's going way beyond the vote tonight. With us now are Dr. Judith Phil. She is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Philadelphia. She has also written numerous articles and a book on male-female relationships. And also with us now is Susan Estrich, a former presidential campaign manager for Dukakis in '88 and currently a professor of law at the University of California. Susan, let me begin with you. Certainly there have been accusations thrown about that Republican members of the Senate Judiciary Committee conducted a smear campaign against Anita Hill. Do you buy into that?
I do. I think they were aided and abetted by the White House in that. You know, I lived through this too painfully back in 1988. Anita Hill came forward with very serious charges. She was and is a very credible woman backed by strong supporting evidence. And what happened when she came forward was that we had Republican members of the United States Senate waving pieces of paper in the air claiming they had stuff on her. We had men who she barely knew being presented as credible witnesses testifying that she had fantasies. We had the White House, frankly, using racism in a way that I hadn't seen since Willie Horton land in 1988. And frankly, I think it was very successful. We had a full-scale spin operation on one side, and the Democrats, whether they were cowed by charges of racism or just trying to find the truth, didn't counter it.
If you think that they're weighing the lesser of the evils in 1991, is it easier to be seen as a sexist than it is to be seen as a racist?
Well, I think the painful truth in 1991 is that when mud gets thrown around, and here we had a lot of mud thrown in Anita Hill's direction, some of it sticks, and that race politics is still a very powerful force in the country, a force powerful enough both to divide the black community, and I think we've seen some of that, and to cow members of the United States Senate.
But how were they able to get to the heart of the matter without asking tough questions about Anita Hill's character?
Well, they did ask tough questions of Anita Hill's character. We had the entire White House operation and the Senate operation out there looking for dirt, frankly, about Anita Hill, and as best as I can tell, they came up with absolutely nothing. Having come up with nothing, they didn't stop at that. They started accusing her of being a partisan political ideologue, a charge that couldn't be further from the truth of this woman's life and experience. They said she was being manipulated by interest groups, even when they knew that the next day witnesses would be coming forward to say that she had made these allegations as long as 10 years ago. I mean, this was just, frankly, garbage. But the garbage gets flung about, and if no one stands up to it, no one says shame on you, and no one says put away The Exorcist and put away these silly pieces of anonymous paper, anonymous letters, and let's go to the merits. When no one says that, the mud sticks.
Do you think that any good has come of all of this?
If you'd asked me last week, Faith, I would have said that the good that came of it was that we were going to take sexual harassment seriously, that for the first time in American politics, women and men stood up and demanded that the Senate take an issue seriously that they were prepared to brush aside without a hearing. I would have said that maybe in offices across the country, the behavior of men and women would change, and perhaps Dr. Sills can add more on that. I fear what's come of it today is that a very mixed message is being sent to women victims, a message that says that if you come forward in a good faith effort to tell the truth about what happened to you, you become fair game for the worst assault I've ever seen in American politics on a non-politician.
Well, let's ask Dr. Sills about it. She's been listening into all of this. Judy, what do you think?
I think that you might want to think about this like a marriage. In the marriage between American men and American women, like a lot of long-term marriages, the surface looks fine. We have children together, we work together, and underneath the surface, there are sometimes very bitter issues. Every so often in that marriage, a bitter issue comes out, and we both have to talk about it. This bitter issue where the woman is angry at her treatment, and the man says, first, me, I didn't do it. Second, wait a minute. How dare you not appreciate how good I've been? That battle that goes on in every marriage in America went on in the Senate. We sent two very distinguished gladiators in the ring, and then we were riveted because we said, that's me. I am that woman. I am that man. That's why the vote's going to go the way it goes.
So do you think that men in general felt threatened by what was being played out before them in the Senate, the sense of it could happen to me, I'm powerless in this?
I think that there's no question about it that every senator and every man watching says, oh my God, I am vulnerable to women. I am at risk, not just my reputation, but the sanctity and stability of my power and my sense of myself is vulnerable to women. And you know what? I don't like that. I'm uncomfortable. Threatened is a very mild word for what goes really deep. However, I do not see this as negative. I see that when an ugly issue comes out on the table, it is the only shot we have as a country or in a marriage. It's the only shot of making things better.
So you think men, in fact, have been sensitized to the issue of sexual harassment?
Oh, I think men have been sensitized, but that's not what I meant. I really meant that I think women have been sensitized to a reality that we wish weren't true, which is if you want equal power, no one is going to hand this over to you. You're going to have to fight. The prize is very worthwhile.
But if you fight and you then end up the result of a smear campaign, as Susan Estridge was just saying, yes, does that not prevent you from coming forward?
No, I don't think so. I think the fact is that one piece of this fight is it was hers. This is a fight where the victory is in millimeters. The smear campaign against Anita Hill, which, by the way, is also being waged by women against her, and maybe most particularly by women of color against her, because she threatens all of us, not just men. She will suffer from that fight. But as a group, what women hear is, if we stand up, we live, some people take our side, and we can feel okay about ourselves.
Judith Still and Susan Estridge, we thank you both so much for talking with us today. Now I'm going to head back to Washington and Tom Brokaw.
Thank you, Faith. We're going to go back now down to the Senate floor, where we're hearing from one of the two women in the United States Senate. This is Republican Nancy Kassenbaum of Kansas, who will vote for Clarence Thomas. She was troubled, however, by his absence of legal credentials and blamed President Bush for that and for the invocation of race. One of the reasons that he was, as he put it, harassed.
Of sexual harassment or the anguish of its victims. On the question before us, some women suggest that I should judge this nomination not as a senator, but as a woman, one of only two in the Senate. I reject that suggestion. The issue before me is whether, with all of the ambiguities surrounding this matter, the allegation by Professor Hill was substantiated to the point that I should change my previous view. Mr. President, I've reached the conclusion that it has not, and I therefore will vote to confirm Judge Thomas.
Objection, so ordered. Who yields time?
I yield 4 minutes to my friend from Florida, Senator.
Senator from Florida.
Thank you.
Mr. President, on 30 seconds of my own time, let me apologize. Every one of our colleagues is prepared to speak in more depth and much longer because they feel so strongly on this nomination, for and against. And unfortunately, because of unanimous consent, we cannot go beyond 6. I only have 44 minutes left to distribute, and I thank my colleague. I know he has much more to say, but I appreciate his taking only 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. In deference to the brief time, I will summarize my remarks. Mr. President, I start this process with the presumption of correctness of the nominee of the President of the United States. I believe that the person elected by the people of America deserves the benefit of the doubt as to the individual who he selects to serve on the United States Supreme Court. As governor of Florida for 8 years, I had the opportunity to appoint many judges, including 4 members of our Florida Supreme Court. The qualities I looked for included intellect, judicial temperament, character, and the ability to grow in the responsibility as a jurist. I apply those same standards to our current responsibility of confirming nominees of the President. Mr. President, the nomination of Judge Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court received my presumption of correctness. During the initial confirmation proceedings of Judge Thomas, I found an erosion of that presumption. I was concerned with several aspects of information developed at that hearing. I was concerned about Judge Thomas's limited experience, concerned about the American Bar Association's qualified recommendation, concerned about actions at the EEOC, particularly that reflected an insensitivity to the discrimination against older Americans, concerned about some of the evasive responses. But in spite of all of that, in spite of the erosion of the presumption, I still was prepared to vote for Clarence Thomas because I felt that he had demonstrated the ability to grow. And I was hopeful that while he might barely be across the line of acceptability today, that in his service on the United States Supreme Court, that he would grow in wisdom and judicial quality. The allegations raised by Professor Hill, in my mind, caused a cessation of that judgment and a turning to 2 fundamental questions. 1, who was telling the truth? And 2, did it make any difference? On the second question, yes, it does make a difference. The charges that were leveled by Ms. Hill are significant. They go to the issue of integrity and character. They relate not only to events that have occurred in the past, but also to a denial of those events today. In my opinion, if those charges were to be believed, then the presumption of correctness would have been erased. Who is telling the truth? Mr. President, we will probably never know the ultimate answer to that question. But I approached this issue by asking this question: what would be Ms. Hill's motivation other than the one that she stated it to be? That is, that she was called upon, did not volunteer, and felt that it was her responsibility as a citizen to answer truthfully. That is a laudable basis for her action. And I have heard no credible alternative motivation suggested. No motivation which is consistent with the manner in which she made this information initially available. So I must accept as essentially a factual statement of the circumstances that which was presented by Ms. Hill. And with that, the presumption of correctness has evaporated, and with that, I cannot vote for Clarence Thomas to be a member of the United States Supreme Court. Mr. President, at a later time, with more opportunity, I wish to talk about some of the concerns that I have about this nomination process, but I would like to add just one thing in conclusion. I listened to these hearings with Mr. President. Could I have one additional minute?
Senator, I've heard really don't have any more time at all. I really don't.
Mr. President, I will withhold that personal experience for a later date, but our country is hurting on this process, and I would hope that we would now turn ourselves to healing. Thank you, Mr. President.
Who yields time?
Mr. President.
Do some editing. Who yields time?
Mr. President, I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished senator from Minnesota.
Senator of Minnesota.
Mr. President, it is clear in the now more than 13,000 telephone calls that my office has received in the past week that the process we're witnessing here in Washington has grabbed and held the hearts and the minds in every American household and in every American workplace. Calls coming into my office, Mr. President, are also telling graphic and personal stories of sexual harassment thousands of Minnesotans have seen or experienced in the workplace. Literally hundreds of callers have felt the need to tell their own stories, many dredged out of distant memories and many laden with guilt and anger at not being told at the time. I was reminded also last night by a fellow Minnesotan that the charges we've heard in this matter follow an entire summer in my state of brutal murders, kidnappings, and cases of physical abuse and criminal conduct directed by men against women and against children. Against Melissa Johnson, Margaret Marquise, Geraldine Steinbuck and her 2 daughters, Jessica and Ashley, Karen Struford, Jacob Wetterling, who's still missing from my hometown after 2 years. Mr. President, there is no way that I can personally understand and appreciate that feeling of anger, but it's real and it's justified, and it must motivate each and every one of us to commit ourselves to using this incredible experience to drive our own future actions, to effectively deal with violence against women and children and deal with sexual harassment in the workplace, including the workplace represented by the United States Senate. This body has a unique role to play in the democracy, which we cannot fulfill, has been demonstrated in this past week if the people don't trust us. The American people know we have difficult problems to solve, and they understand that, but they cannot tolerate hypocrisy. That this Congress would pass a series of laws on civil rights, worker safety, and yes, sexual harassment, and then exempt itself is hypocrisy, pure and simple. Our colleague, Senator Grassley, has tried to show us the way for years on this, and now we finally understand what he's talking about. It's time to get our house in order now. Others, including my colleague from Kansas, have dealt with the weight to be placed on the weekend's events. Mr. President, I will vote for Clarence Thomas because the substance of what I know about him is more compelling than the single character charge I've heard made against him. Those who've been acquainted with him and worked with him for decades, including many women co-workers, say he is a man of character, determination, and courage. And the hearing certainly bolstered that impression. His mentor is our colleague Jack Danforth. The strength and the character of that relationship over the last 12 years has been exemplary. And what put to the ultimate test, that relationship has been remarkable. So I come, Mr. President, to the same judgment today that I did when I met Clarence Thomas face to face. That he is a person America could be proud of.
Time is expired.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the balance of my statement be put in the record until delivered.
Who yields time?
President, I yield 4 minutes to my friend from Connecticut and apologize. It's only 4 minutes. Sorry.
Mr. President, first of all, let me thank the distinguished manager on the floor and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Mr. President, like my colleagues, I have a lengthy statement here that I have prepared, but I will ask unanimous consent that that be included in the record as if read. Mr. President, I think like all of us, or many of us here, we begin with a presumption to support presidential nominees for whatever position, including the United States Supreme Court. That has been the case with this senator. Over the past 10 years, I have supported all but one of President Reagan's and now President Bush's nominations to the United States Supreme Court. Regretfully, Mr. President, in this case, I will not support this nominee. Mr. President, if I had to paraphrase the remarks that I prepared, it comes down to the issue of doubt, serious doubt. I certainly, like everyone else, was deeply impressed with the background of Clarence Thomas. It's a compelling story. There are very few in our generation who've been born in the post-war period that have traveled the distance that this man has in the few short years of his life. Mr. President, I'm also impressed with his intellectual and legal background as a graduate of Yale Law School in my home state of Connecticut. But, Mr. President, I was left with doubts that were reflected in the first series of hearings which Clarence Thomas testified regarding his appreciation of case law and precedent, his unwillingness, for I think now obvious reasons, to express his own views on some of the important matters that have been before that court. I regret that Clarence Thomas may have been overhandled by people from the White House and elsewhere to counsel him as to how to respond to questions. In a sense, Mr. President, I blame ourselves in part for that, because God help anyone who comes up and expresses a definitive view on one of the hot-button issues of our day. So in a sense, we bear culpability for people who are unwilling to come forward and express those views, or the fact that the universe, or the world in which we choose these candidates from, has so shrunk that anyone who really does have any views could not pass muster in this body. Mr. President, like everyone else, I was riveted to our television sets this weekend watching the compelling testimony before the Judiciary Committee. I have great admiration for the chairman of that committee and members. They were put in the terrible position of having to deal with a very, very divisive, a very emotional topic and subject matter, sexual harassment. Mr. President, I could draw no definitive conclusions from this weekend, except, of course, that sexual harassment is an issue that deserves far more attention than has been given over the past number of years in this country. But I didn't leave necessarily with one clear idea of who was guilty of perjury or guilty of the crime charged. But, Mr. President, I was left with doubts. It was not cleared up for me. And, Mr. President, I happen to believe that when voting for a nominee to serve on the highest court of this land, where the only weapon the court has is moral persuasion, they can't point a gun at anyone's head, they can't bring an army together to make sure that their decisions are obeyed by the people of this land. It is only moral persuasion which ultimately allows them to carry the day. And, Mr. President, I would be deeply concerned that that moral persuasion, the only weapon of the court, would in somehow be eroded by this nomination. For those reasons, I have my doubts. And I happen to believe if doubts are primarily what you have, then it seems to me you must err on the side of caution, if erring is going to be the case. Mr. President, if Judge Thomas is confirmed, I hope to be proven wrong about these doubts. But, Mr. President, I cannot take that chance for as much as a 4-decade appointment to a court that will decide many of the compelling issues of our day. I have great respect for our colleague from Missouri, and I spoke with him recently before taking the floor to tell him personally of my decision. It's not been an easy decision. In fact, I was leaning in favor of this nomination. But because I could not rid my own mind of the doubts that have been gripping me over the past number of weeks, that I regretfully have taken the decision I have this afternoon, Mr. President, and with regret, I will vote not to confirm Judge Clarence Thomas to be an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Mr. President, I yield back to the chairman of the ballot.
Mr. President,
South Carolina.
That's Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut, who was undecided and has just announced that he will not vote to confirm, that he has grave reservations. He is, that's not unusual from his ideological or political position. He is a liberal member of the Congress, although the other senator from Connecticut, a slightly more conservative Democrat, Joe Lieberman, we do think that will vote for confirmation. Also, Chris Dodd, I think this had no bearing on his vote, is one of Ted Kennedy's closest friends. We want to show you the vote as we have a tally now at NBC News. We still show Clarence Thomas one vote short of confirmation. This is our tally based on what we have been able to line up this afternoon, telephone calls to the various undecided senators and buttonholing them in the halls and so on. For his part, the Senate Republican leader, Bob Dole, says, however, that in fact they are now over the top. He believes that they have more than 50 votes. And John Danforth, who has been the Republican sponsor of Clarence Thomas, called the judge at home late this morning to say that it's looking very good. At least that's how he described it publicly. My guess is that he probably told him, we now think that we have enough votes to get you confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's where we stand at this hour. We are marching toward a 6 p.m. vote, 2 hours and 5 minutes away. That will come on the floor of the United States Senate. Most of the members of the Senate now have a pretty good idea of where they all stand. So let's go to a commercial. We'll be back after this. Floor of the Senate.
Not objection to order. Who yields time? Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I wish to thank the chairman of the committee for yielding time, and I I understand, I say on behalf of many of us, the difficult job he has in parceling out time. I had intended to make some lengthy remarks here, but in just the few short minutes that are now being allocated to senators to speak, I wish to make just a couple of points briefly. Number one, I made my decision on this nomination before all of the events of the past weekend and before the allegations, those hearings explored, were made. I made my decision to vote against the nomination of Judge Thomas based on the record of the first hearing, based on my analysis of what I regard as a still evolving judicial philosophy and a variety of other issues and concerns which I discussed here on the floor of the Senate last week. I have not changed the conclusion which I reached at that time. I will elaborate on my reasons for the record. I did wish on this occasion, however, to make a very few remarks about the hearings of the last several days. First of all, I understand the perception of many in this country that Judge Thomas has been treated by the process unfairly. There are many more telephone calls being received in my offices in favor of Judge Thomas than calls being received in opposition to Judge Thomas. Many feel the leak was inherently unfair and that as a result the charges came to light at the last minute and this was unfair. And I also would like to say that I think it would be wrong to judge Clarence Thomas as an individual on the basis of one's perception of these allegations, even if one concludes they are true. He's a very complex individual, as everyone is, and I think that the testimony of his friends and acquaintances over the years is very powerful. But, Mr. President, we owe fairness to Professor Anita Hill also. She did not ask to come forward. She was pulled into this process also by the leak. And she came and gave testimony which seemed to me to be extremely honest and credible. I know the country's polarized now on all of these subjects, but I regret very much that at one point she was charged by a senator with having perjured herself. I disagree strongly with that characterization. I thought that everything she said was very logical, and I thought the four corroborating witnesses who talked about how she had confided in them 10 years ago at the time this took place were very believable and credible. I also think, incidentally, that one of the things we've all been learning about on the subject of sexual harassment is what goes on inside the mind of a victim, which sometimes leads that person to keep silent about it and to continue maintaining a facade of friendship and an outward relationship so long as that secret is kept. But, Mr. President, this discussion of the allegations here was, in a sense, a microcosm of larger questions, also involving a large change in our way of thinking about the relationship between men and women. This court, if Judge Thomas is confirmed, will be decided.
You are watching NBC News coverage of the confirmation debate of Judge Clarence Thomas for the Supreme Court.
He had no conversation with any individual ever on the case of Roe v. Wade, for example. Is that a credible statement? I'm not sure that it is, Mr. President, but the point is we will be making a decision here on someone who will serve on the court for 40 to 45 years, and I stand by the original decision that I made before these hearings were held over the past several days, and I will vote against Judge Thomas.
That objection to who used that?
Thank you.
Alabama's right there.
Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, I stood in this chamber in support of the nomination of Judge Clarence Thomas. Mr. President, I stand here today, a witness, like all of my colleagues here in the Senate, to one of the most public, one of the most painful and perplexing spectacles ever to befall the United States Senate. I don't think there's a member of the Senate, Mr. President, who wasn't affected in some way by this process. And clearly, both the nominee and Professor Hill suffered under the glare of these hearings. But, Mr. President, we're not here today to only discuss the process and its faults. They're glaring. They're many. We're here today, Mr. President, to decide whether there's sufficient evidence that Clarence Thomas sexually harassed Anita Hill. Mr. President, I take very seriously charges of sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I've been outspoken about the problem of sexual harassment in our armed forces. Sexual harassment has no place in our military, in our government, or, Mr. President, in corporate America. I do not take Professor Hill's allegations lightly, and I believe that it is not only fair, but, Mr. President, it's appropriate that the Senate acted to hold hearings on this issue. In fact, these hearings will undoubtedly serve to bring an issue out into the open that has for too long been hidden in America's workplaces. Mr. President, the point is not how bad sexual harassment is. We stand in agreement, basically, on that issue. We come back instead to the question that has plagued the committee, the Senate, and the American public. Was Professor Hill sexually harassed by Judge Thomas? This is a question I've been struggling with since learning of the allegations through the media last weekend. Chairman Biden, in his opening remarks, reminded us that our judicial process maintains the presumption of innocence. I've read the FBI report. I've listened to the testimony presented during over 3 days of hearings. I've sifted through reams of additional information submitted during this hearing process. And as a former prosecutor, Mr. President, I know the onus now is on myself and 99 of my colleagues to review the information made available during these hearings and decide if there is sufficient evidence to conclude that Judge Thomas sexually harassed Professor Hill. Both Professor Hill and Judge Thomas were credible, forceful witnesses. But for me, doubts linger. Questions remain. I'm simply not certain that these allegations have been fully substantiated. I wonder, for instance, why Professor Hill followed Judge Thomas from the Department of Education to the EEOC even though her job at education was safe. Why Professor Hill testified that she never saw Judge Thomas outside of the office, only to have Judge Thomas state under oath that he had been to her home on a couple of occasions. Testimony Professor Hill later confirmed. Mr. President, why Professor Hill, in a conversation with the Washington Post, qualified the EEOC telephone logs as garbage and that she had not called Judge Thomas except to return his calls. Only later, under oath, did she admit that she initiated some calls to Judge Thomas. And why, during 4 previous Thomas nominations, Anita Hill never came forward with this information. Although this is not a trial in the ordinary sense, we have no choice, I believe, except to look to established traditions and guidelines to decide if the burden of proof has been met. Mr. President, there are inconsistencies. The testimony is inconclusive. I've weighed the evidence, studied the hearing transcript, and have searched my soul during these past several days. Now, the decision is to whom you give the benefit of the doubt. Mr. President, I give it to the man accused, Judge Thomas, and I ask unanimous consent that the remainder of my statement be made part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Who yields time? Who yields time? The senator from Ohio. President. I yield myself 4 minutes. Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I rise to restate my opposition to the confirmation of Clarence Thomas to be Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. 1 week ago, before the postponement of today's vote, I elaborated at length on my decision to oppose Judge Thomas, so I will not go on at length today. My opposition was based upon his record at the EEOC, his lack of concern for the rights of the elderly, his legal credentials, the views expressed in his speeches and writings, and his testimony before the committee. Everything in Judge Thomas's record suggests that he will be an active and eager participant in the current Supreme Court's ongoing assault on established court decisions protecting civil rights, individual liberties, and the right to choose.
Judge Thomas's refusal to discuss that record with the committee in a candid and straightforward manner confirms my concern that he will move the court in the wrong direction. Mr. President, the past several days have been some of the most difficult that I've experienced as a member of the United States Senate. The recent hearings into the charge of sexual harassment leveled against Judge Thomas were painful, exhausting, and torturous for everyone involved in them. I think my colleagues in the committee will agree that one would have to look long and hard to find that anything good resulted from these unprecedented proceedings. This was an ordeal. However, it is ridiculous even to attempt to compare anyone's suffering in this matter with the horrible and destructive experiences of both Professor Hill and Judge Thomas. And after listening to them both testify, both forceful, both articulate, it is almost impossible for me to fathom how one of these people could be the cause of the other's pain. When I heard Judge Thomas speak to our committee, he was persuasive. I found myself wanting to believe him. But when I heard Anita Hill testify to our committee, I was deeply moved. When I heard her, she was calm, sincere, and very believable. I cannot imagine that she was telling us anything but the truth. It was an outrage, Mr. President, that the committee's confidential documents were leaked to the press. In that connection, I have asked for and will support an investigation into that matter. There is no argument that these hearings will be remembered as unfortunate, unsenatorial, and at times just plain ugly. Inappropriate things were said and done. Allegations and innuendos and malicious charges were tossed about. With regard to Professor Hill, those charges were, in my opinion, unfair. Issues were raised that had nothing to do with whether or not Anita Hill was telling the truth about Judge Thomas. And now, Mr. President, on a personal note, I want to say a word about the hearings. If a senator is to fulfill his responsibility as a member of the Judiciary Committee, he or she ought to be judicious. At one point in the hearings, I was not. While questioning Mr. Doggett, I unfairly asked him questions about allegations lodged against him. I shouldn't have done that. It wasn't fair to him, and I apologized by personal letter to him that same day. Senator's time has expired. Mr. President, I will oppose Judge Thomas for the reasons I have set forth here today and for the reasons I've stated previously at the committee and here on the floor. I ask unanimous consent. The balance of my statement may be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Who yields time? The senator from South Carolina. 3 minutes to the senator from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. President, I am going to vote for the confirmation of the nominee of the president. I'd like to note that Clarence Thomas is perhaps the most investigated nominee to the Supreme Court in America's history. He has had five FBI background investigations inquiring into every conceivable aspect of his life, his character, his education, his personal behavior, under almost all circumstances. He has withstood this, and he has withstood the extraordinary inquiry, and in my opinion, he has emerged unscathed. How many of us could say the same if such an investigation had been conducted of us? Mr. President, if I were convinced that the charges by Professor Anita Hill were true, I would vote against the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. The charges were serious in my view. However, the Clarence Thomas described by Anita Hill is not the Clarence Thomas I watched endure the 100-day-plus inquiry by the Senate Judiciary Committee. I don't recognize Anita Hill's Clarence Thomas in any aspect of what I personally saw during the hearings. Anita Hill's Clarence Thomas is not the Clarence Thomas the FBI investigated. He is not the Clarence Thomas that Senator Danforth worked closely with over all these years. Whatever Anita Hill has claimed about Clarence Thomas, no one else who has ever known him supports her description nor believes that he is capable of the actions she has alleged. No one who supported Anita Hill's allegations in any specificity or with any particularity appeared in the Judiciary Committee hearings supported her notion of him. Even those who declared themselves supporters of Professor Hill know nothing of the alleged particulars. Indeed, no one who has spoken under oath confirms any of the allegations made by Professor Hill. Some of my colleagues have asked,
this is the Senate floor. You're watching Senator Domenici of New Mexico, Republican, who announced at the outset that he would vote for Clarence Thomas. And he has, at least by the new NBC News count, 49 other colleagues who agree with him. NBC News has been keeping track of these senators all day long. And we now believe that Senator Domenici is one of 50 senators who will vote for Judge Clarence Thomas for nomination and confirmation to the U.S. Supreme Court. For confirmation as an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Still 7 undecided. He'll probably pick up 1 or 2 of those, perhaps more. But with 50, he is in if our vote count holds up. Because if it's a tie, then the Vice President of the United States, as I have said here repeatedly today, will be able to cast a tie-breaking vote because he presides in the United States Senate. And that's Vice President Dan Quayle. NBC's Chief Congressional Correspondent Andrea Mitchell is standing by right now. Andrea, you have been following these proceedings from the beginning, not just from the Anita Hill episode. What do you think that the long-term effect will be on other legislation as these senators now have to go back and work one with the other? You heard today Senator Kennedy looking across the chamber at Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania and saying, shame, shame. Specter answering in return, the senator from Massachusetts should not be coming onto this floor and uttering the word shame when he's talking about women. Can the two of them ever work together again, or was that just politics as usual?
It was a little worse than politics as usual. I think that we haven't heard anything like that. At that moment, I was watching with a former senator, a veteran here of 31 years, William Proxmire, and he sat up and said, well, I've never heard that kind of personal attack. It was quite unusual. But we have also seen after the Tower nomination, the brutal fight a couple of years ago, that people did come together, and it very quickly began to get back to the former kind of comedy, the friendliness here on the Senate floor. There will be a new test of that very shortly, either the end of this week or the beginning of next week. Senator Danforth, who you pointed out, ironically, is the chief supporter here of Clarence Thomas, will go against the White House and introduce his civil rights bill, on which he, Specter, Metzenbaum, and Kennedy all working very closely together. So that will be the first test, really, to see whether they can get over their differences here on the Thomas nomination and work together on a bill that none of them really love because it is a compromise, but work against the White House on that.
Andrea, I want to ask you as well about the special interest groups that we've been talking about here so much. We should point out that they're not made up of aliens from Mars. These are special interest groups made up of American citizens who have their own interests. Too many of them are narrowly defined, both from the right and left, in the judgment of a lot of political analysts. Today I heard both Senator Danforth and Bob Dole say we've got to step away from them. We've got to declare our independence from them. And yet the reason they have been so effective is that in a political arena in which there's such a low voter turnout, these groups turn out the vote. Do you think that they will continue to have the influence in 1992?
I think they will. Now, in this case, it has been political interest groups who are not the big spenders. But basically, when you get to the issue of political special interest groups, you're talking about the major industries in this country, and these are the very people who contribute money to campaigns. And one of the victims of this whole process, the Thomas nomination, and also the Gates nomination, and how that has tied the Senate up in knots for many, many weeks, is that we have yet to come to any resolution on campaign finance reform. That won't happen this year, and as long as that doesn't happen, special interest groups will have more than their say, more weight than the rest of the American people in what issues are debated here in the United States Congress.
All right, Andrea, I want to go down to the White House now, where NBC's John Cochran is standing by. And as you told us last night, John, the president was feeling pretty confident 24 hours ago. He went out for a a Mexican dinner last night and was feeling fairly ebullient. Where does he go from here now in terms of dealing with the country and dealing with the damage that indisputably has been done to the American political process?
Tom, we might know as early as tonight. They're still debating here whether or not to invite Clarence Thomas down to the White House this evening. I was told by one senior aide here that if Clarence Thomas wants to come down here after the vote tonight, the president will say, come on down. After Judge David Souterby was approved by the Senate for a Supreme Court justiceship, he was not invited to the White House immediately. The president did his congratulating with a phone call. The Thomas nomination is something entirely different. The president, for example, could have Clarence Thomas come down to the White House. The president could make remarks, either combative or healing. I know that my colleague Jim Miklashevsky and I have talked about this at some length. Jim thinks that the president is going to be quite combative. My guess is that in the early going, the president will be fairly mild in his remarks, talk somewhat about healing, although he may take a shot at the Senate Judiciary Committee's process of confirmation. And then I think the president will wait until he gets back out on the campaign trail to really go after the Democrats on this score and the special interest groups whom you referred to, Tom. My feeling is that in the early going, the president, however, is going to be low-key and not combative.
John, was there any sense of kind of ironic relief that now that they have won this one, and as bitter as it was, as much of an ordeal as it was for the country and for the principals, obviously, from the White House point of view, it took the country's mind off what is a pretty dark economy?
Well, no, because we're going to be reporting on the economic indicators each week now, and they may be good or they may be bad. And the White House thinks they'll probably be very mixed. The Democrats will make the most of that, and then the Democrats will say it's partly cloudy, and the White House will say it's partly sunny. So no, as Bob Dole pointed out, I believe to you, Tom, the nation will get back to business pretty quickly. This, however, has left a very bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. I'm not sure whether George Bush is going to let this carry over and be a grudge. George Bush is a smart enough politician to know that you can disagree with somebody on Monday and have to do business with them on Tuesday.
All right, thank you very much, John Cochran. We want to remind you that we will have continuing coverage right up and through the vote, and then on NBC News tonight, on Nightly News, we're going to take a look at many of the issues that were involved here, including the issue of sexual harassment, which has been raised to new heights in this country. The question is, now that Judge Thomas has been confirmed and Anita Hill's claim has been in effect rejected by a majority of the U.S. Senate, what will that do to women who feel that they are being sexually harassed? Will they be discouraged from coming forward, or will we have a whole new set of procedures in this country? That's just one of the many issues that we'll be addressing here on NBC Nightly News tonight. Now, we'll tell you that we'll have continuing coverage right after this. As well, that our independent tally of the United States Senate indicates that Clarence Thomas does now have enough votes for his confirmation as an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. We think that he has at least 50 votes. The Republican leader of the Senate, Bob Dole, who keeps a probably more direct count than we do at this point, believes that he could go as high as 56 votes. In any event, it does now seem a foregone conclusion that at 6 Eastern Time tonight, Clarence Thomas, for 103 days of the confirmation procedure, followed by 4 memorable, historic, and many people believe tragic days of testimony by Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, that he will be confirmed. This is Senator Cole of Wisconsin speaking.
Whatever decisions we make on that nomination accepted by the American people, which we have been elected to represent and which we seek to lead. Thank you, Mr. President.
Who yields time? Senator from South Carolina? For how much time? 2 minutes. The senator from New York.
Mr. President, I rise to support the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. And like most Americans, I've tried to determine whether the very grave allegations against Clarence Thomas were true. I believe that the burden of proof in this case and all cases rests with the accuser, not the accused. And clearly, that burden has not been met. It's a fundamental tenet of our system that everyone is innocent until and unless proven guilty. Now, before these allegations, I supported Judge Thomas's elevation to the Supreme Court on the merits, and I continue to do so. But I would be lax if I didn't take this opportunity to express my dismay with the confirmation process. Notwithstanding Chairman Biden's efforts to see to it that fairness was afforded to all, the confirmation process has run amok, and all of us have become victims. Judge Thomas has been its victim. Professor Hill has been its victim. And we in the Senate have been its victim. Judge Thomas's testimony when he told us of how he had lost his reputation after being the target of unsubstantiated allegations hit home with this senator. More than most, I understand how that feels. Even raising allegations such as these puts the accused through a living hell. Justice Thomas had the opportunity to defend himself, and the American public found his defense convincing. But many do not have that ability, and I'm afraid that we've reached a point where any allegation is deemed proof of guilt. And that's wrong, and it's un-American. I believe that Judge Thomas will be confirmed later today, and I applaud that. But I believe that we in the Congress have a duty to see to it that this process is never repeated again. When anyone becomes the victim of unsubstantiated allegations, we are all the victims. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Who yields time? Senator from South. 1 minute. Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I've previously taken the floor to say that I know Clarence Thomas to be a man of integrity, of character, great ability, and great intellect. However, despite the fact that we had hearings which should not have been held in public and information was leaked, I felt it was necessary that we have a hearing on the allegations made against him, and I've reviewed the FBI reports and the testimony. I find serious inconsistencies in Professor Hill's statements and testimony. She said she was traumatized, yet she followed him from the Department of Education to the EEOC. She continued to maintain favorable comment and contact with Clarence Thomas, and even, according to two sworn witnesses, spoke highly of his nomination in August. I believe that the charges against Judge Thomas are unsubstantiated. We must not ruin his character. I ask unanimous consent that the full statement be included in the record as if read, and I ask that my colleagues support the nomination of Judge Clarence Thomas to be Associate Justice.
Without objection, full statement will appear in the record. Who yields time? The senator from Delaware yields 2 minutes to the senator from Rhode Island.
I thank my colleague from Delaware. On Thursday, October 3rd, I announced my decision to oppose the confirmation of Judge Thomas to be an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. This was prior to the public airing of Professor Anita Hill's allegations of sexual harassment. Today, 10 days later, and after the hearings into this matter, I see no reason to change my vote and will oppose the confirmation of Judge Thomas when that vote is taken shortly. Regarding the hearings looking into the charges of sexual harassment by Judge Thomas, I can only say that having watched the proceedings these past few days, I don't know whether Anita Hill or Clarence Thomas is telling the truth. I do believe that given the seriousness of the charges involved, it was appropriate to delay the confirmation vote last Tuesday and hold hearings. I believe, too, that these hearings were conducted in a fair, judicious manner, and I commend Senator Biden and the Judiciary Committee for their work. However, my original reasons for opposing the nomination of Clarence Thomas, namely the lack of demonstrated judicial distinction and his extremely conservative philosophy, the philosophy already well represented in the court, are independent of any determination of Judge Thomas's guilt or innocence regarding this matter. Accordingly, I see no reason to change my decision, and I speak, too, as one who has voted for the confirmation as justice of every present sitting justice on the Supreme Court. I yield the floor.
Who yields time? Who yields time? Joe? The senator from Delaware yields 4 minutes. The senator from California.
Mr. President, I was the first senator to rise in opposition to this nomination. I did so before I ever heard of Anita Hill. I came out against confirmation because Judge Thomas had no clear or distinguished record on fundamental issues upon which his qualifications could be judged, and because he refused to reveal his general philosophy on many of those issues to the committee. I also came out against Judge Thomas because I doubted his veracity when he declared he had never discussed Roe versus Wade with anybody. I watched the Hill-Thomas hearings on TV, and now my opposition to the nomination and my doubts about the judge's veracity are much stronger. I differ with those who assert that the burden of proof rests on those who charge Judge Thomas with sexual harassment. This is not a criminal case where he faces jail. The burden is on Judge Thomas and his supporters to prove that he is fit to serve on the United States Supreme Court. I urge my colleagues to consider, as I have, the following facts. None of Judge Thomas's character witnesses had any personal knowledge relevant to the charges against him, but 4 witnesses appearing for Anita Hill did have personal knowledge relevant to the charges. 2 of them testified that Ms. Hill told them about the alleged sexual harassment by Judge Thomas long ago. 2 of them testified that Ms. Hill told them that her supervisor made sexual advances. Her detractors suggest she was speaking about somebody else, not Judge Thomas. But it turns out her only other supervisor was a woman, Allison Duncan. Angela Wright, like Anita Hill, has accused Judge Thomas of making sexual remarks to her and pressing her for dates. Also like Anita Hill, Ms. Wright confided about this at the time to a friend, Rose Jordan, according to a sworn statement by Ms. Jordan. Levita Coleman Jr. has stated that when Judge Thomas was at Yale, he discussed with her and with others X-rated films he had seen. Another woman, Sukari Hardnett, a former special assistant to Judge Thomas, has come forward to complain about the atmosphere in his regime at EEOC, stating, if you were young, black, female, and reasonably attractive, you knew full well you were being inspected and auditioned as a female. It's worth noting that the alleged remark by Judge Thomas about hair and coat need not have originated, as suggested by his supporters, in a book he says he never read, The Exorcist. According to Catherine McKinnon, an attorney who is an expert on sexual harassment quoted in the October 12th New York Post, the alleged remark was a clear reference to scenes in a pornographic film. Some think that after all this there will be greater understanding of sexual harassment and how to cope with it. I wonder. The lesson may be that if you complain about sexual harassment, you will be attacked as a liar, a fantasizer, or a woman scorned. A great lack of understanding of a woman's reaction to sexual harassment is on display. Suppose you're a woman representing a cause or a corporation on Capitol Hill. Suppose a member of Congress sexually harasses you, as does happen. What do? You have these choices. 1, publicly complain and get attacked as Anita Hill was attacked when she came forward. 2, avoid having anything to do with the harasser forever after and end your capacity to represent fully your cause or your corporation and perhaps lose your job. 3, seek to maintain a cordial relationship with the harasser so you can retain your job. That's the choice Anita Hill made at the time the alleged harassment was occurring. And look at the personal attack she's suffering because of that choice now that she's come forward. These are sorry choices for women to face, and it's a sorry choice we senators face today. I yield the floor.
Who yields time? Who yields time?
I yield 4 minutes to my friend from Alabama.
The senator from Delaware has yielded 4 minutes to the senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I have endeavored at all times to be fair to the nominee, fair to the president, fair to the nominee's opposition, and fair to the American people. I came away from the first round of hearings with many doubts in my mind about Judge Thomas. I stated that Judge Thomas's answers and explanations about previous speeches, articles, and positions raised thoughts, and I emphasize thoughts, not findings, of confirmation conversion, of inconsistencies, ambiguities, contradictions, lack of scholarship, as well as other thoughts. I stated that our nation deserved the best on the highest court of the land, and that an error of judgment could have long-lasting consequences to the American people. The doubts were too many. The court is too important. And so I said I would follow the admonition, when in doubt, don't. At the time I made my speech on the floor of the Senate announcing my decision to vote against Judge Thomas, I'd never heard of Anita Hill or her charges of sexual harassment. Following my speech, I was informed for the first time about Anita Hill. The issue of Anita Hill and her allegations of sexual harassment did not enter into my decision on whether or not to vote for him. Now the second set of hearings have occurred. I have more doubts now. The original doubts have been compounded by the doubts raised in the last hearings. I won't attempt to enumerate all of these newly created doubts, but obviously there are doubts about who is telling the truth, doubts about motivation, doubts about psychological defects about both Professor Hill and Judge Thomas. Throughout both sets of hearings, I've tried to be a judge rather than an antagonistic advocate. I think this is the role that an independent-minded member of the Judiciary Committee should assume. My job at the hearing was to try to get the facts and find the truth the best way I possibly could. I simply chose to use my time to ask questions and not give political speeches. My responsibility was to judge and not be a cheerleader for or against Clarence Thomas. As a result of the first hearings, there are many clouds hovering over the process and Clarence Thomas. During the second set of hearings, clouds thickened considerably over the Senate, the process, and Clarence Thomas. In addition to this, very thick clouds hovered over Anita Hill. In my judgment, the clouds and the doubts should not be transferred to the Supreme Court. The doubts are many. Some would say that they should give Clarence Thomas the benefit of the doubt. I think that would be very appropriate if he was charged in a criminal setting in a court of law. But this is not a court case. There is an absence of clear and convincing evidence to remove these doubts. A lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court is different from other appointments. Unless these doubts are erased, eliminated, or greatly minimized, we should not gamble on the consequences. In my judgment, Clarence Thomas should not be confirmed under the clouds and the doubts created. Therefore, my position has not changed, and I will vote against his confirmation. I ask that my prepared remarks be placed in the record instead of my abbreviated remarks. I would also like to say that I fully support a thorough and complete investigations in regards to the leaks in this matter, as well as leaks that have occurred in the Senate Ethics Committee. I think the Senate cannot continue to operate under a situation in which there are constant leaks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the remarks of the senator from Alabama will be printed in full. Who yields time? Senator from Delaware?
I yield 3 minutes to the senator from Michigan.
3 minutes, Senator from Michigan.
I thank the senator. The serious charges made by Professor Hill are important and a vital part of this consideration. But this nomination need not rest on a determination of that matter. The basic issue here is plain and simple legal qualification and the suitability of this nominee to hold a lifetime appointment to one of the highest offices in our land. These exalted and rare positions should go to the men and women of all races and ethnic background on one basis and one basis alone, and that is exceptional qualification, towering legal ability and achievement, professional standing within the legal profession of the very highest rank. To settle for less trivializes the court and threatens to turn it into a privileged sanctuary for persons who lack such qualification and who may instead have some narrow ideological agenda of their own to pursue. Now, Clarence Thomas has a record of a decade of bizarre and questionable legal theories and policy positions that he has spoken numerous times, views he suddenly said at his confirmation hearing that he really didn't mean or that he no longer believes. His professional record at EEOC was erratic and highly controversial and damaging to the rights of thousands of people who brought forth complaints of workplace discrimination. The appearance is that he stepped on the rights of others to please the higher-ups in the Reagan administration and advance himself. I believe in affirmative action and that people of color
should serve on our federal judiciary. But any nominee, regardless of race, sex, or ethnic background, must meet the absolute standard of the highest professional qualification unique to the highest court in our land. At age 43, with very limited courtroom experience, Clarence Thomas does not meet that standard. The American Bar Association has a process whereby the most distinguished lawyers in America carefully evaluate the formal legal credentials and qualifications of Supreme Court nominees. Since 1955, they've assessed now 23 different Supreme Court nominees in that process. You know where Clarence Thomas ranks among those 23 in legal qualification? He ranks dead last. He ranks dead last. The lowest rating of any Supreme Court nominee in history. And what a sad commentary. And it says volumes about the purpose of the Bush administration when selecting this nominee. The clear appearance here is that the qualification he had was political, not based on his professional qualification. It appears he was selected despite his lack of professional qualification because he was a black, ultra-conservative, young enough to apply that extreme philosophy to the court's decisions for the next 40 years. And that's going to affect the rights and liberties of every single person in this country, perhaps as long as the next 4 decades. It's just as simple and as crass as that. And the nomination should be rejected on those grounds. I thank the chair.
Who yields time? Senator from South Carolina. Senator for Wyoming is recognized for 8 minutes.
Mr. President, before the clock starts, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the statement of Senator Conrad Burns of Montana.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I want to thank Senator Joe Biden and Senator Strom Thurmond for their extraordinary work. This has not been an easy task. Obviously, it is not. It has not been pleasant to go through the weekend and miss the things that you miss in a weekend in the fall. Don't feel sorry for us. But I can tell you they did it with firmness and fairness, and they were very patient and extraordinarily attentive to what we were trying to do. And I want to commend them both. Splendid work, and I'm very proud to be a member of the Judiciary Committee. I don't make any apologies for that at all. I don't know what more we could have done with the information furnished us, with the way the woman furnished it to us. And that's the way it is, in spades. You can't do things to other people and say you want to keep it in confidence. They formed this country to get away from that kind of conduct. Now let's remember how this thing got started. She didn't want to provide her name, and our chairman and ranking member protected her. And then she finally came forward and said, let the committee see it. It doesn't have anything to do with sexual harassment. It has to do with behavior. Please let the committee see that, but don't let the public see it. And we did that. And then somebody in this place who surely will suffer some serious penalty leaked that to the media. And then a member of the media read it to her. Said, what do you think of this? It's all over town, which it wasn't. And then said, you either let us go with it or we'll have to go with it anyway.
Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming still complaining about the leak that led to Anita Hill's appearance before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was one of the most outspoken of the Senate Judiciary Committee members, and ironically enough, he has just been complaining that Anita Hill wanted her charges made confidentially, and he said that is why we formed this country, to get away from that kind of practice. And yet it was the same Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming who at one point, quite dramatically in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing, said, you would not believe the stuff that is coming over the transom. I've got letters, as he put it, falling out of my pockets about the conduct of this woman. The letters have come from Tulsa and other places, and he said it just would get involved in the sexual harassment crap, as he described it. And then he refused to disclose any of those letters or any of the charges that he said were being made against her. So there have been any number of those kinds of double standards that have been conducted in the course of the last 5 days on both sides of the aisle, I dare point out. This is the vote as NBC News now projects it for Clarence Thomas. 50 votes, enough to confirm his nomination to the U.S. Supreme Court. We think that he'll probably go over that number. As you can see, we still have 7 senators undecided that we have not been able to get them to tell us one way or the other how they will vote. But one of those who was undecided to almost the very end is the Democratic senator from the state of Georgia, one of two. White Fowler, the junior senator from Georgia, former member of the House there, in a tough re-election campaign, it is widely believed, next year. Senator Fowler, what finally prompted you to come down on behalf of Clarence Thomas?
Well, Tom, I think, first of all, that those of us who tried to go through the whole confirmation process, make sure that all the record was in before we made up our minds, are trying to do a service to all the people of our country, not to make premature, instant decisions. I think it's the most important decision that a United States Senator makes, because we're actually, in my case, voting for over 6 million Georgians who have no recourse if we make a mistake. If you don't like White Fowler, you can throw him out next year. If you don't like the president, you get to vote him out. In this case, it was tough. It was close. But the President of the United States holds the trump card. If we question the qualifications of a nominee or don't think he's adequate, we don't get to substitute our judgment. The fact that Clarence Thomas was a Georgian, came up the hard way and demonstrated independence and determination were qualities that I hope and believe that he will demonstrate when he becomes an independent man on the Supreme Court of the United States. But as you know, there are no constitutional guidelines. Each senator has to make up his mind on a variety of many, many factors.
Well,
and this was difficult.
Let me ask you about how much liberal pressure you received from some of the groups who were adamantly opposed to his nomination and would think of you on many other issues as a friend in their court.
Well, I don't think there's any question that, I like all this controversy in the sense that people petitioning their government, expressing strong opinions, hopefully informed opinions, are part of what makes our democracy work. I do understand those who, many of them on the other side, who believe they know how Judge Thomas is going to vote. I don't know how Judge Thomas is going to vote. I have to call him as I see him in the beginning, but there is no question that my vote is not universally admired, and I might pay a political price at the polls next year, but that comes with the territory of being a United States Senator.
Senator Exton of Nebraska said that he was casting a vote for Clarence Thomas, but without any enthusiasm. Would you characterize your vote the same way?
No, I wouldn't put it that way, because I prefer to look forward. Mine is a vote of hope and promise that, as I just said, that Judge Thomas will be an independent thinker, will put all kinds of ideological considerations behind him and judge each case and controversy on the merits. But also part of the good things that I hope will come out of all of this controversy is that we have simply got to change our procedures for dealing with cases of sexual harassment. It disturbs me tremendously that we are sending a message to the country that the United States Senate treats the working women of America and their bravery in coming forward with any charges somehow trivially. And I want to challenge the President of the United States when we take up the Civil Rights Bill next week, which he has said that he will veto. And one of the reasons that the White House has said is that it gives causes of action to women on cases of sexual harassment and gives punitive damages to those who win sexual harassment cases. I think it's more important now to see whether or not we have the same kind of principles applied from the White House that are being sought to be applied in the case of this nomination.
Thank you very much, Senator White Fowler, who was undecided until today. And he has now decided that he will vote for Clarence Thomas, who comes from Pinpoint, Georgia, after all. Very substantial black population in Georgia. That has been an important part of White Fowler's constituency, not just as a senator representing all of them, but he has counted heavily on their support in re-election and election times for both the Senate and the U.S. House. Now let's go back down to the floor of the United States. No, let's go to Faith Daniels in New York instead of going to the floor of the Senate. Faith, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Tom. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Anita Hill's accusations not only shed light on sexual harassment, it also brought the issue to the forefront in the workplace. With us now are two women who work in the New York State Division of Human Rights Office, which investigates such cases, Margarita Rosa and Chantal Beltro. What do you think, Margarita, the impact of all of this has been on the issue of sexual harassment?
I think it's quite clear that the national awareness of the phenomenon of sexual harassment has increased significantly as a consequence of these hearings and of the allegations that Professor Hill made.
Do you see that in terms of hard numbers and how many phone calls you're receiving, Chantal?
Yes, I do. Actually, since last week, the amount of phone calls that we've been getting at my division has increased tremendously.
What are they talking to you about? Is sexual harassment now being defined once and for all in the workplace?
Well, first of all, many people are calling and they're asking if they have been sexually harassed. They will tell us a story as to what's happened to them, and then we determine whether they have been sexually harassed or not.
And what happens at that point if you believe that they have been harassed?
Well, what we do is we try to give them an appointment if they're within the statute of limitations. Now, with us, we have 365 days from the alleged date of the discrimination. If, however, it's over that, which in most cases has been now since we've been getting calls, we refer them to court because they have up to 3 years to file a complaint with the state court.
But the truth of the matter is, Margarita, that it is still very, very difficult for women to prove these charges. It was very, very difficult for Anita Hill to prove these charges. It came down to a case of he said, she said. Do you find that that is universally true?
Not universally true, but more often than not it is true. And that's because of the nature of the conduct that we're talking about. It's not conduct that people tend to engage in front of an audience. It generally takes place behind closed doors. It might take place in whispers. It clearly takes place outside of the public arena in most instances. So what you are left with is making credibility determinations, which are not that easy, as you can see from the events that we've witnessed over the last few days. And let me add that in the case of Professor Hill, she had corroborating witnesses.
Do you think that having it played out in such a public way is going to hinder other women eventually from coming forward?
I think that the increased awareness is very important. And I think that while the manner in which Professor Hill has been treated in this process may serve as a deterrent to some women, I think you cannot underestimate the value, the educational value to some extent that this process has had in terms of making people aware that there is such a thing as sexual harassment, what it constitutes, and that there are laws that prohibit it and laws that give women an avenue for redress in the event
Except
that
she seemingly paid a high price for coming forward.
And in many instances, victims that come forward do pay a high price. But on the other hand, we also find that in many of these cases, the employers are aware that the potential publicity can be very damaging to them and to their image. And so consequently, often we find that in sexual harassment cases, more often than in other kinds of cases, the parties are willing to settle the case, to resolve the case before it reaches a point where there's a great deal of publicity.
What percentage of these cases are actually unfounded?
It's difficult to say because it really is very difficult to give you a percentage of the cases that actually are unfounded. You'd have to take all the cases through most of the process in order to really reach a conclusion.
But to the best of your knowledge, you work with this all of the time. Do women come forward with these charges when there isn't legitimate cause?
There are some instances in which the motivation is very questionable, but I would say that they are the rare exception, because it's a grueling process, as you can see. The investigation looks closely at the allegations and at other witnesses, and it's a very embarrassing topic for people to have to confront. So for women to come forward and put themselves in the position of having to be scrutinized in the manner in which Professor Hill has been scrutinized in this instance, and in the manner in which is often the case in these cases, requires that they give it some serious thought, and I think most women are hesitant to come forward.
Margarita Rosa and Chantal Beltré, we thank you both for talking with us now. Now I'd like to go back to Washington and return you to the debate on the Senate floor. Senator Cohen from Maine is now addressing you.
Professionalism at all times with them. Mr. President, the proceedings conducted by the Judiciary Committee were said not to be a trial. But of course, everyone was on trial before the court of world opinion. The accuser, the accused, the Senate as an institution. And I think it's clear to all that a Senate committee limited by time
constrained by the number of its members, tilted by political allegiances, could not effectively resolve the doubts raised by the charge of sexual harassment. Procedural and evidentiary protections provided in a judicial proceeding were inapplicable. Sharp and tough cross-examination before those blazing lights and television cameras were neither feasible nor politically acceptable. So we're left at the end of this process where we began, uncertain where the truth lies. Although there clearly is doubt, I intend to resolve that doubt in favor of Judge Thomas. Now, it's been argued by some, principally by Judge Thomas's opponents, that as long as a shadow of doubt falls across the Supreme Court's nominee's integrity, that nominee must be rejected. But if we allow doubt itself to be sown by a single individual to be a reason for rejecting a nominee, then I think we've set in motion a process which holds the potential for undermining or destroying any nominee for any public office. And I cannot bring myself to be a party to that. Mr. President, if the phone calls in my state are any indication, the popular vote for me would be to vote against Judge Thomas. The calls are running heavily against him. So the easy thing and the popular thing for me to do would be to vote no. It might, history might show it to even be the right thing to do. But Mr. President, I do not believe it's the fair thing to do under these circumstances, and for that reason, I intend to support his nomination.
Who yields time? The Senator from South Carolina.
I yield 2 minutes. Senator from Georgia.
Senator from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. President, I believe we must try to lower our voices and to seek understanding if anything good is going to come out of this ordeal. First, the only clear and unmistakable wrongdoing and injustice in this case is the unauthorized leak of Professor Hill's allegations to the news media. In my opinion, this action overrode the rights of both the accuser and the accused and virtually guaranteed that dispassionate analysis of the charges would be impossible. I will support any steps to get to the bottom of this and all other leaks which have recently plagued the Senate, including the imposition of appropriate penalties on the wrongdoer. Secondly, the nomination and confirmation process in this case has been flawed from the outset and has been thoroughly political at every step of the way. The failure to give adequate attention to Professor Hill's charges in a timely fashion was only one of the last in a series of failures in both the executive and the legislative branches, which do no honor to any of us. Third, unlike some of my colleagues, I found nothing in the testimony to disprove Anita Hill's allegations. I've heard from too many women verification that Professor Hill's behavior in this case is entirely consistent with that of a victim of sexual harassment. However, there was nothing to prove the charges either. And therefore, on the central question of the confirmation of Clarence Thomas, the weekend hearings were inconclusive, in my opinion, and will not change my earlier decision to vote for the confirmation of Judge Thomas to the Supreme Court. Fourth, whatever our votes on Judge Thomas and whatever the outcome of the confirmation vote, we owe something more to the women of America than to leave it at that. May I have 2 more minutes? I thank the chairman and my chairman.
Senator is recognized for an additional 2 minutes.
It seems to me we must not send the message that victims of sexual harassment have good reason to fear for their reputations and their livelihoods if ever they come forward to seek redress of their grievances. The most distressing news to come out of the weekend hearings was the inadequacy of our existing systems for dealing with cases of sexual harassment. The lack of confidence that many women feel in these systems should call all American institutions, that includes the United States Senate, to re-examine and reform our mechanism for handling such cases. We will also have the opportunity in the near future to produce something more than just rhetoric in combating sex discrimination. I would hope that when the Senate takes up Senator Danforth's civil rights bill in the near future, we will treat sex discrimination equally with all other forms of discrimination. Finally, Mr. President, it is my fervent hope that the United States Senate and the President of the United States have also learned something from this sordid affair. The continued politicalization of the judicial nominating process threatens the very future of our republic and its democratic institutions, whether judicial, executive, or legislative. In order to maintain the integrity of the American judicial system, we must find a way to transcend the purely political battleground upon which presidents and senators appear to have become so comfortable. I thank the chair.
Who yields time?
Of 2 minutes to my friend from Massachusetts, who should be yielded 30 minutes in light of his patience. I'm sorry, it's all I have.
Mr. President,
Senator from Massachusetts is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. President, I'm interested to hear my colleagues talk about the state of the evidence and the doubt. The fact is that in this case, the sum total of all of the evidence on behalf of Judge Thomas is his denial, and witnesses who are friends who have offered a stubborn denial that their friend and their candidate for the Supreme Court could have done what he was accused of. But none of their statements directly, or none of what they saw directly contradicted.
You are watching NBC News coverage of the Senate debate on the confirmation of Judge Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Anita Hill telling them.
As we resume our special NBC News coverage of the Senate debate on the confirmation of Judge Clarence Thomas, we will tell you as well that we are now about 1 hour away from the scheduled vote at 6 Eastern Time that will take place in the Senate chamber after 4 memorable, extraordinary, and many people believe agonizing days in the political and judicial history of this country. That's John Kerry, Democrat of Massachusetts, that you see there, who is opposed to Clarence Thomas. We know that we're approaching a critical moment because on the presiding chair right now is the Vice President, Dan Quayle, who could cast the tie-breaking vote if necessary. And NBC News does believe that Clarence Thomas has at least 50 votes, but we think he'll probably go over that because there are still about 7 votes undecided out there. So it does appear likely tonight that Judge Clarence Thomas will be confirmed for the U.S. Supreme Court. The big question in this country is what happens next, not just to Judge Clarence Thomas and how he rules on the court, but to Anita Hill, this institution, the United States Senate, and the American political process. Where do we go from here? Was this a watershed time? Well, let's go back to the Senate floor now and hear what are the reflections of many of these senators.
Now, in the end, we're not called on to make a courtroom judgment about whether or not somebody should go to jail, and that's precisely the point. The standard for the Supreme Court is not whether or not the nominee has met the standard to avoid going to jail or not be found perhaps guilty of a felony. It's whether or not the nominee meets the highest standards of the Supreme Court of the United States, and I've already spoken on that issue.
Senators, 2 minutes have expired.
I ask unanimous consent that the full text of my comments be placed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Who yields time?
President, we
The Senator from South Carolina.
expecting Senator Robb momentarily, and Senator Nunn, and Senator Danforth, and that completes our
Mr. President, how much time is the Senator from Delaware controlling?
Senator from Delaware has 1 minute and 46 seconds remaining.
Thank you very much, President.
Who yields time?
How much time we have?
The Senator from South Carolina has 25 minutes and 30 seconds left.
Mr. President,
who yields time?
Mr. President, I would yield unto myself 30 seconds of the time on this side of the aisle. 30 seconds.
Senator from Wyoming is recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. President, I would place into the record an article from the Boston Globe of July 28, 1991, telling us what would happen in this situation as the groups began the crank up on this particular nomination. It's a very remarkable relation. And then, if I may enter into the record, a remarkable column from this morning's New York Times by A.M. Rosenthal, who has a deep affinity for the clarity and the reputation of the New York Times, entitled Harassment by Press, which is a fascinating document that I think most Americans would be very interested in seeing.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to
Senator from South Carolina.
place into record from USA Today, statement by Armstrong Williams.
Without objection, so ordered.
Article from Charleston Post.
Now.
In Courier, Senate should confirm Thomas.
Without objection, so ordered.
Also petitions by people in the EEOC who back Clarence Thomas.
President.
Who yields time?
I yield Senator Danforth, how much? 10 minutes.
Mr. President, I ask the chair to inform me when I have 2 minutes remaining. Mr. President, let me start by thanking my colleagues on both sides of this debate for their tolerance during the past 3.5 months. I know that I have been something of a pest, hounding Republicans and Democrats alike, asking for support of Clarence Thomas. And fortunately for one and all, that time is now drawing to a close until we get to the Civil Rights Bill, of course. Mr. President, when the President named Clarence Thomas to be his nominee for the Supreme Court, he described the nominee to be the best person in the United States for the job. Many people poked fun at that description, but this senator believes that the description was well-founded. I believe that Clarence Thomas is what America is all about. He captures in himself the American spirit, the tradition of being able to make the most of your life and apply yourself and to contribute something with your life.
Mr. President, could we have order, please?
Senate will come to order.
I believed on July 1st that he was an outstanding choice, and I believe that even more today. During the past few weeks especially, Judge Thomas has demonstrated a strength of character which I think is extraordinary. He has endured, particularly over the last 10 days, the agonies of hell. And I believe that as a result of that, Clarence Thomas is more sensitive to constitutional rights, to the necessity of legal protection of the people of this country than most people who could conceivably be nominated for the United States Supreme Court. In a way, Mr. President, this is a debate between those who know Clarence Thomas and those who do not. What has been striking throughout the past 3.5 months is the number of people who have known him very well, who are friends of Clarence Thomas, who have come forward. Last week, a group of 18 women who had worked with him in various jobs here in Washington held a press conference and described with tears streaming down their faces the Clarence Thomas they knew and the concern they had with what was going on in the confirmation process. I remember very well, Mr. President, the joy last July 1st when I was told by the White House of the Clarence Thomas nomination. And I remember talking to Judge Thomas on the night of July 1st. I remember exactly where I was during that phone conversation. I was in the manager's office of the Shrine Club of Kirksville, Missouri, and I can remember the tremendous joy both in Clarence Thomas's voice and in my own as we visited over the telephone. But, Mr. President, joy has long since left both Clarence Thomas and Jack Danforth, and the many friends of Clarence Thomas. There is no joy in these proceedings, and no matter how the vote turns out, no joy is possible. The joy that we experienced 3.5 months ago has turned to pain. And the best that can be said is that in approximately another hour, there will be a feeling of relief at the determination one way or another. Clarence Thomas, especially in the last week, was liberated because he said to me that he does not need this job of being on the Supreme Court of the United States. He can survive without being an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. And, Mr. President, very candidly, so can the country. But what cannot survive, in the opinion of this senator, is the values that we hold so dear as a country. I do not believe that our values as Americans can long survive the process that we have witnessed, particularly during the last 10 days. Mr. President, 10 days ago, this nomination had been won. The confirmation battle had been won. We believed that we had 60 to 65 votes in favor of Judge Thomas's confirmation. That was after the FBI report had been written. That was after the FBI report had been reviewed by members of the Judiciary Committee. That was after the members of the Judiciary Committee decided to a person that no further action was required, that no further study was necessary. That was up to 10 days ago. And then 10 days ago, the confidential document and apparently details from the FBI report itself were leaked to the press. And on Sunday a week ago, this story went public, and it was carried as the lead item on the network news and the headline item in the newspapers. And that was the beginning of the process that culminated with the hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Mr. President, it is the position of this senator that the process that we have just seen is clearly wrong. It is wrong for Clarence Thomas, and it is wrong for the United States. It must be stopped. The business of interest groups fanning out through the country, digging up dirt on a nominee, the business of leaks of confidential documents put out to members of the press, the idea that absolutely anything goes if necessary to stop a nominee for the Supreme Court of the United States, this whole process must be ended. We in the Senate have the power to encourage the process, or we have the power to stop it. We have the power, by the vote that we are about to cast, to say to our country that the strategy of digging up dirt, the strategy of throwing dirt, the strategy of leaking confidential reports does not work. Mr. President, I speak to those senators who find the choice before us to be a difficult choice, who find it to be a close call whether to vote for or against the nomination of Clarence Thomas.
He has 2 minutes remaining.
I thank the chair. The New York Times today took the position that in the case of a close call, it should be resolved against the nominee. I believe that if that is the rule that we follow, that the burden of proof shifts to the nominee where charges are made, then the result of that will be to encourage just such a situation to be replicated again and again and again in the future. The reason the burden against the accuser must be very heavy in a case such as this is to discourage exactly the kind of process that we have seen, particularly during the next 10 days. Mr. President, Clarence Thomas can survive without confirmation by the United States Senate. But If we vote against Clarence Thomas, we reward a process which is clearly wrong. And for that reason, not for the sake of Clarence Thomas, not for the sake of the Supreme Court, but for the sake of the basic American standard of decency and fairness, I ask senators to vote for the confirmation of Clarence Thomas.
President.
Who yields time?
Mr. President, the manager has asked me to yield time at this point to myself. He will shortly return.
The senator has 1 minute and 42 seconds remaining. The senator from South Carolina has 15 minutes and 3 seconds. 15 minutes and 3 seconds.
And the senator from Delaware?
1 minute and 39 seconds.
Mr. President, I announce my intention to oppose Clarence Thomas's nomination to the Supreme Court based on his public record and on the Judiciary Committee's first hearings. I did this back in September, and I urged my colleagues to reject the nomination of Judge Thomas based upon his record, his mishandling of age discrimination cases at EEOC, and his failure to define his constitutional philosophy, especially on the right of women to choose. The nominee was willing to express his views on the death penalty and other issues, but refused to admit even having a view on choice. About Judge Clarence Thomas, there can be clearly said there are more questions than answers. His lack of judicial experience is undeniable. His judicial philosophy remains a mystery, and his commitment to protecting the right to privacy in the most critical decisions women must be allowed to make free of government interference is doubtful. I heard Professor Anita Hill's allegations through the public media at the same time it was learned by the American people. I was concerned at that time that these serious allegations had not been considered by the committee, and joined many of my colleagues in pressing for a delay in the vote. I watched this weekend's extended Judiciary Committee hearings in Seattle along with the rest of America. And like many of my constituents who called my office to express their views, I found the experience troubling and inconvenient.
The time of the senator has expired.
I thank the chair and ask unanimous consent that my full remarks appear in the record, and I would hope the president will look to his selection process, for that process, as well as ours, clearly needs improvement.
Without objection, so ordered. Senator from South Carolina.
I yield 12 minutes. David Simmons from Virginia, Mr. Robb, and if senator I yield the rest of the time here.
The senator from Virginia is recognized for 12 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had tentatively concluded prior to urging a delay in this vote that I would vote in favor of Judge Thomas's nomination. That tentative conclusion was based on my sense of the man and my perception of his convictions, his inner strength, and his core values. I did not and do not believe that he has any specific ideological agenda, and I do believe that he is prepared to interpret the Constitution and laws of the United States as fairly as possible. This Supreme Court nomination has been a series of battles. The current battleground is sexual harassment. But in the hearings that preceded the Judiciary Committee's vote, there were other issues. Those issues, like civil rights and choice and their importance, should not get lost in the current firestorm. Judge Thomas and I have discussed affirmative action and quotas at some length. I found in Clarence Thomas a man who understood both the strengths and the weaknesses of the types of remedies our society has constructed to attempt to strike the right balance in improving opportunity for all of our citizens. Judge Thomas has told me that he supports certain types of affirmative action, but that he doesn't believe that his own son deserves preferential treatment over a poor white child from Appalachia. I find his views on the need to move to class-based remedies to help the disadvantaged of all races intriguing and thoughtful. The other issue is choice. I have discussed choice and a woman's fundamental right to choose with Judge Thomas, and he told me that he had never taken a formal position on Roe v. Wade and believed it was inappropriate to do so in the context of the confirmation process. I take him at his word. I am concerned that too often nominees are evaluated in the light of a single issue, and I continue to caution against single-issue politics. Concerns about these specific issues have been raised passionately and effectively by individuals and organizations I have sided with much more often than I have opposed. But I must confess I have also been deeply troubled by the view implicit in much of the articulated opposition to Judge Thomas that he is less entitled to his own opinions because of his color. That because of his color, he must advocate specific ends to means that I believe he and his detractors agree on. I cannot countenance that restriction on individual freedom any more than I could countenance racism. This is not to say, however, that I would have handled this nomination as it has been handled. Would I have preferred a nominee who was more forthcoming in his answers on philosophical issues? Yes. Do I agree with all of Judge Thomas's writings and speeches? No. Would I have preferred a nominee with greater experience on the bench and at the bar? Yes. But as governor, I myself appointed an even younger man to the Virginia Supreme Court, and he conducted himself with distinction. Well, that was my thinking before last weekend's hearings. And those hearings did not change my instincts on who the man was and what his beliefs are. The hearings clearly challenged my instincts, but after watching all of the witnesses and struggling with their testimony, I am resolved to affirm my original judgment and vote for Judge Thomas's confirmation. The case presented against Judge Thomas with respect to sexual harassment was compelling. Professor Hill is a credible and serious witness, but Judge Thomas's statements in his own defense were equally strong and compelling. Although some were more persuasive than others, the witnesses who appeared on behalf of both principals were credible. The absoluteness of the differences between the statements of the two principals is impossible for me to reconcile, even after watching their testimony and that of their witnesses. I am not prepared to rule out the possibility that they both believe they are telling the truth as they remember it. I was struck that it would have been very much out of character for either of the principal witnesses to engage in, condone, or encourage sexual harassment of any kind, and equally out of character for either of them to lie. But I cannot reconcile their individual statements. In the end, I must evaluate the testimony made on their behalf. Professor Hill's witnesses corroborate the fact that she had indeed raised the issue long before Judge Thomas was nominated for either court. Judge Thomas's witnesses say that what she alleged is totally out of character for the judge. At bottom, I am swayed by the fact that witnesses who testified on Judge Thomas's behalf know both the judge and Professor Hill, and they have sided with Judge Thomas. There is no question in my mind that all of the individuals and groups whose knowledge of Clarence Thomas comes principally from his speeches, his writings, and the information presented during the confirmation process, those who feel most passionately about his nomination are overwhelmingly opposed. And that includes most of those with whom I have been aligned politically over the years. And they will be understandably disappointed with my vote. On the other hand, I am equally convinced that all of those whose knowledge of Clarence Thomas is based on actually working with or for him, or on some other regular, personal or professional basis, in other words, those who know Clarence Thomas best, uniformly confirm my own impressions of the man and his capabilities. I talked to someone in this latter category by telephone late last evening as I was concluding the agonizingly difficult process that all of my colleagues have gone through. That person that I spoke with is someone I have known and respected for over 15 years. That person happens to be a lawyer, an Afro-American, and a woman who takes allegations of sexual harassment seriously, who describes herself as a liberal and is adamantly pro-choice. She also happens to have been a law school classmate of Judge Thomas and probably knows him as well or better than anyone who testified for or against him. And she supports him to the hilt. She believes, as I believe, that Clarence Thomas has qualities that are not as apparent to those primarily concerned with ideology. It is with a combination of visceral instinct about his core values, an acknowledgement that those who know him best are his most ardent supporters, and hope that he will ultimately surprise many of those most concerned about his ability to fulfill the legacy of Thurgood Marshall, that I will vote for Clarence Thomas for the Supreme Court of the United States. Mr. President, I thank you, and I yield back any time remaining.
How much time we have left?
The senator has 6 minutes and 43 seconds.
6 minutes?
6 minutes.
The senator from none in the hall there. Mr. President,
The senator from South Carolina is recognized.
I yield myself this time making it quiet. I'd like to follow up on one point that Senator, excuse me just a minute. I yield a half minute to
Mr. President, I thank the
senator
distinguished
from Idaho.
able senator from South Carolina. I ask unanimous consent to extend my remarks in the record as though read in favor of the nomination.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, until Senator Nunn comes in, I'd like to make a brief statement. I'd like to follow up on one point that Senator Specter made earlier regarding Ms. Hill's credibility. Prior to her joining Judge Thomas at the Department of Education, Ms. Hill was employed with the Washington law firm of Wall, Hardrecker, and Ross. Ms. Hill testified it was never suggested to her at the firm that she should leave the law firm in any way. She further stated, "Well, I left the law firm because I wanted to pursue other practice." Ms. Hill was questioned about her employment options when Judge Thomas was to become the chairman of the EEOC. She stated that she faced the realistic fact that she had no alternative job, while she might have gone back to private practice, perhaps in an old firm. Mr. President, I have received a copy of an affidavit from Mr. John L. Blake, Jr., dated October 13, 1991, and Mr. Blake has stated that he was a partner in the firm of Wall, Hardrecker, and Ross when Ms. Hill worked there. In fact, Mr. Blake evaluated Ms. Hill's work and has stated that, and I quote, "I expressed my concerns and those of some of my partners that her work was not at the level of her peers, nor at the level we would expect from a lawyer with her credentials, even considering the fact that she was a first-year associate. I suggested to Anita Hill that it would be in her best interest to consider seeking employment elsewhere, because based on the evaluations, her prospects at the firm were limited, based on Anita Hill's performance evaluations at Wall, Hardrecker, and Ross. Returning to that law firm at the time of Clarence Thomas moved from the Department of Education to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was not an available option," end quote. Mr. President, clearly this statement by Professor Hill is in direct contradiction with a statement made by Mr. Blake, a former partner of the Wall law firm who evaluated her performance. I find Professor Hill's testimony to be an inconsistency which should be pointed out. Mr. President, I find it disturbing that Professor Hill was not straightforward with the committee about this matter. Clearly, she knew that there was dissatisfaction with her performance at the Wall law firm. Her testimony about her employment there was clearly misleading and inaccurate. This point should be made and bears on her credibility in relation to the rest of her testimony. On your own time.
I don't think I have any time, but I'd like to mention another affidavit
from South Carolina has the floor.
The senator said.
Yeah. The senator from South Carolina has the floor. And he's not yielding.
Mr. President, has Senator Nunn come in yet? Mr. President,
if there's nobody wishing to speak, could the senator yield briefly?
I'll give you the rest of the time. I yield Senator Simpson the balance of the time.
The senator from Wyoming is recognized for 2 minutes and 50 seconds.
Mr. President.
Mr. Chairman,
The senator from Wyoming is recognized.
Mr. President, may we review the time situation?
The senator from Wyoming is now recognized for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. That is the balance of the time. And there is no time remaining on the other side prior to 5:30.
Mr. President, let the record be clear. I would like to recognize my friend from California and my friend from Massachusetts. Senator Nunn has reserved 3 minutes. It's now less than 2, and I must yield the balance of the time to Senator Nunn of Georgia.
The senator from Georgia is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask that the statement of the senator from California be included in the record.
Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I will vote to confirm Judge Thomas. When I announced earlier this year that I would support the nomination of Judge Thomas, I did so because I was convinced that he met the test of intellect, integrity, and open-mindedness. Now we're faced with a different set of circumstances and allegations that we all are very familiar with, having watched the proceedings. Mr. President, I would ask that my complete statement be put in the record. I do not have time to go into the reasons, but I would like to say that I believe
this is NBC News continuing coverage of the Senate debate on the confirmation of Judge Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court.
I believe that Anita Hill's testimony is incredible.
Good evening, everyone. This is NBC News continuing coverage of the Senate debate of the confirmation hearings of Judge Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court. And based on the NBC News tally, Judge Clarence Thomas now has the required 50 votes to go to the U.S. Supreme Court as an associate justice. He could probably go higher than that. That is based on our telephone tally today and buttonholing various senators who were undecided. Senator Bob Dole, who is the Republican leader in the Senate, believes that he will go perhaps as high as 56 votes. Most of the undecided have been going to him if they came out of the South and they were Democrats. Other northern liberals were disinclined to vote for Judge Thomas. Let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell now, our chief congressional correspondent, and see what we can expect from here on. Andrea?
Well, Senator Nunn will probably be the last speaker before they go to concluding speeches from both sides by the majority and minority leaders, George Mitchell and Bob Dole. Senate schedules tend to slip a bit, Tom, but they are trying to vote by 6 o'clock this evening East Coast time. That is their unanimous agreement. So there will be concluding remarks from both sides. As you've seen, Vice President Dan Quayle is in the chair. His vote will not be needed. They already have, by our count, at least 52, and I think they're about to get another vote with the declaration from Senator Sam Nunn, who's now on the floor. Although they were well over the numbers they needed, that did not mean that the supporters of Clarence Thomas were going to rest easily. In fact, Strom Thurmond, the ranking member, Republican ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, just moments ago introduced a very negative affidavit from a former lawyer, a lawyer who worked in the firm that Anita Hill had worked in Washington, claiming that she was let go from that firm. Well, that allegation has been disputed by all of the senior managing partners of that law firm. So this was what, by all accounts, is an unfair allegation made at the last minute last night by Republicans and inserted into the Senate record, read out loud just moments ago by Strom Thurmond, even though they had already gone over the top. Tom?
Thank you, Andrea. This long national ordeal is by no means over, but at least this part of the episode is drawing slowly to a close. It will end not with a bang, but with a sense of exhaustion. Let's go to the floor now as we watch the continuing debate on the confirmation proceedings. We're getting down to the final stars. Alan Cranston now is on the floor.
Partnership to leave the firm. She said, I've been told that today a former partner stated otherwise. That is not correct. I asked that this affidavit appear in the record as if read in full, and I want to add that this attorney Donald Green, who issued the affidavit that I am reading, stated that he, not the other attorney, was the one that evaluated the work of people in that law firm.
Objection. Without objection, so ordered. The Republican leader is recognized.
And I have 14 minutes. The Senator of Massachusetts. I appreciate minority leaders. Mr. President, I want
I want to do that to indicate the Senate's not going to fall apart over this vote.
What's going on here is that they're getting down to the final exhausting details, and they're ending up in a squabble over an affidavit that was introduced by Strom Thurmond that was submitted by a senior partner in the law firm that she worked for shortly after she graduated from Yale, that is Anita Hill. She says she left the law firm voluntarily. That former managing partner says, though, in fact, they were not happy with her work, and they thought it would be better if she sought work elsewhere. Once that was released by the Thomas supporters, other members of that law firm, which has now been disbanded, said, no, the original partner was wrong. He didn't do any of the evaluation. That is an incorrect summary of her work there. So that's where we wind up here on the floor of the United States Senate, pretty much where we began, with lots of contradictions, lots of petty squabbles, and big squabbles, for that matter, as well. This is Senator Bob Dole, the Senate Republican leader.
The vote last Tuesday, in my view, he would have been defeated. His nomination would have been defeated. It seems to me now that there's been hardly any defections. So despite all the dramatic events of the weekend, as I look at my little score sheet and try to count votes, the pool we had last week is pretty intact, pretty much intact. Senator from West Virginia indicated he was voting no, but he wasn't in the pool. Senator from other senators indicated they were voting against Judge Thomas, but they weren't not in the pool we were looking at as potential Thomas supporters. So I would suggest, after all said and done, and after all the drama, and after all things that have happened over the weekend, many of us watched every moment of the debate, with exception maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes, or the proceedings. It seems to me that we're now in a position to make a judgment, having had the delay, having had the additional information from Professor Hill, from Judge Thomas, from supporting witnesses on each side. It also seems to me that it boils down to a question of credibility. This is not a referendum on sexual harassment. If a referendum on sexual harassment, the vote would probably be 100-0, or should be 100-0. This is a referendum on Clarence Thomas and his nomination to the Supreme Court by President Bush. We'll have plenty of opportunities in the future to address the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace or anywhere else for that matter. And I believe that you'll find most senators, regardless of party, regardless of philosophy, are going to be supporting the appropriate position in those cases. We're back now where we were a week ago, when a majority of us, Republicans and Democrats, were prepared to say that Judge Thomas was qualified to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. I guess the one question that I have is how much of a burden we placed on Clarence Thomas. How much of a burden will he carry for the next 6 months or year, 6 weeks, who knows how long, with last-minute allegations fully aired to millions and millions and millions of Americans? And will it have a lasting impact when he reviews various kinds of cases, including cases of sexual harassment? Mr. President, in my view, this will make Judge Thomas even a better judge, a stronger judge than earlier indicated. Having gone through another test of his strength and his character, in my view, he's in a stronger position. Let me also take time to pay tribute to my colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's something they didn't ask for. We agreed on the delay.
Judge Bob Dole, who's the Senate Republican leader, with a tribute to Judge Clarence Thomas, saying that he thinks he'll be a better judge now that he has gone through what has been, for him, a very long ordeal, but an ordeal shared, especially in the last week or so, by the country. And as this has played out on television, it has had an extraordinarily wide audience, not just in this country, but around the world, and a very interested audience as well in the tiny town of Pinpoint, Georgia. That's the hometown of Clarence Thomas. And there today, his mother, Leola Williams, was watching these television proceedings, the Senate debate that was going on. Their heretofore obscure little community.
I ask you, Master, to go on the roll. I ask you, Jesus, to give my son this opportunity to show the world what he can do for this nation. I ask you, Jesus, to take care of him, Jesus. guide him, lead him the way that you want him to go. Give him the faith, knowledge, and understanding. Fill him up where he's torn down and strengthen him where he's weak, Jesus. Lord, forgive the people that is against him, Jesus. They know not better. Amen. Please forgive them. Whosoever trying to hurt him, harm him, criticize him, forgive them, Lord. I give they don't know, they don't know what they're doing. Please, Jesus, help them. They need help bad, Lord. I ask you to please strengthen my child. Don't let him fall down by the wayside. Thank you, Lord. Help him. Lord, just let him help us. Help us as a whole, black and white. Please let him help this nation. They're trying to keep him from helping us, Lord. But I ask you, Jesus, to please give it to him. Lord, it's in your hands.
Leola Williams, who is the mother of Clarence Thomas, gathered with friends and family members at a neighbor's house today for a prayer session on behalf of her son. How could she have known 43 years ago when he was born that one day he would become the second black man to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court, and he now seems to be just moments away from that reality. NBC's John Cochran at the White House right now. John, there's been a lot of confidence there for the last 24 hours or so. Any reservations, any regrets?
Well, just regrets that this leak occurred in the beginning, but the feeling now is not be combative. The White House strategy will be to low-key, to try to get past these next few days without exacerbating these rather tender feelings anymore. The president will not have Clarence Thomas down to the White House this evening after the vote. We had speculated on whether that would happen. Apparently, Thomas has not asked for such a meeting, and so the plan right now is for after the vote, the president will speak to Clarence Thomas either at the Thomas's home or up at the Capitol if Clarence Thomas happens to be there. And then at some future date, the president will see Clarence Thomas, possibly not, until he's actually sworn in as an Associate Supreme Court Justice, which could happen, they're talking possibly Monday of next week. Then we get into the question of what about what George Bush has been saying for the last several days about suggesting his own reforms for this Judiciary Committee confirmation process. I'm told now that will go on the back burner for a while. We'll hear much less about that. The president will not be, once again, combative. He will get together with his advisors, his legal advisors, his speechwriters, and try to find an appropriate forum, a dignified forum, I am told, and maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the line, he will come up with his ideas for reforming this confirmation process, Tom. But the idea now is not to pick any unnecessary fights.
John, we're told that Senator John Danforth, who has been his ally in this Clarence Thomas confirmation proceeding, but his adversary in the Civil Rights Bill will strike tomorrow with the new civil rights legislation on the floor of the Senate, hoping now to take advantage of his new relationship with the president to try to get that through. How are they going to respond to that at the White House?
I get no signals here at the White House. There's a feeling that they want to make a compromise with Senator Danforth beyond what they've offered before. And, you know, the president's man in the Senate Minority Leader, Bob Dole, told you earlier today that what John Danforth should do is to get onto the president's team. What really bothers President Bush is he has his own civil rights bill, and the president says everybody talks about the Democrats' bill, about the Danforth compromise bill. George Bush says, I'm for a civil rights bill. Why don't they look at my bill? And the president feels he has offered some concessions, so I don't detect any softening here toward Danforth.
All right, thank you very much, John Cochran at the White House tonight. As you heard, the president hopes to become actively involved in the reform process up here on Capitol Hill, because he does expect to submit before his term is out possibly at least one more U.S. Supreme Court nominee if he wins re-election next year, and we're by no means forecasting that this evening. We'll be back with more after this. Judge Clarence Thomas is now just moments away from what should be the biggest moment in his life, although it is one without joy, according to this speaker, Senator John Danforth, who has been his principal sponsor in this nomination for the U.S. Supreme Court.
The one really heartening thing, I think, from the standpoint of Clarence
has
Thomas,
had very strong feelings about the whole procedure and about his friend, a man he says that he loves.
Who have felt so deeply about this nomination. This has been the case ever since last July. People who knew him in Missouri, who worked with him in the Attorney General's office. People like his friend Larry Thompson from Atlanta, Georgia, who came up here and spent time helping Clarence and working with him because they'd known each other working at Monsanto in St. Louis. People like Janet Brown and Nancy Altman and Alan Moore and so many others who had worked with him in my office here in Washington. People at the EEOC, black, white, physically disabled, with tears in their eyes, supporting Clarence Thomas. That is the heartening thing. One thing that happens in the nomination process is that the enemies of a nominee tend to portray the nominee as some kind of monster. And the great way to offset that is for people who know the nominee to come forward. And that is what has happened with respect to Clarence Thomas, and it is very gratifying. Mr. President, Clarence Thomas is going to surprise many people on the United States Supreme Court. He is going to be a good and competent and decent and fair justice. He is going to be the people's justice on the United States Supreme Court, and in my opinion, it is a great moment for our country to confirm the nomination of Clarence Thomas.
Mr. President,
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. President and members of the Senate, this year marks the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights, the most eloquent and compelling statement of the limits on government and of the rights of individuals against the power of government ever devised, adopted, or enforced. As elected officials, members of the Senate are sworn to uphold the Constitution, of which those rights are an integral part. Ultimately, however, in our system, it is the Supreme Court which is the arbiter of the Constitution. That's why one of our most important responsibilities is to advise and consent on those nominated by the President to serve on the Supreme Court. It's been said often in recent weeks, including today, that a high level of controversy over Supreme Court nominees is new to our history. But that's not true. Nominations to the Supreme Court have often been contentious. In June of 1968, the last time a Democratic president nominated someone to the Supreme Court, President Johnson nominated Associate Justice Fortas to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. On the very same day that the nomination was made, 19 Republican senators issued the following statement, and I quote, "It is the strongly held view of the undersigned that the next Chief Justice of the United States and any nominee for vacancies on the Supreme Court should be selected by the newly elected president after the people have expressed themselves in the elections. We will, therefore, because of the above principle, and with absolutely no reflection on any individuals involved, vote against confirming any Supreme Court nomination of the incumbent president." Close quote. In the nomination now before us, our Republican colleagues have repeatedly said that 100 days to consider it is too long. But the last time the situation was reversed, they wanted a delay of 7 months to even begin consideration of the nomination. The hearings on the Fortas nomination were stormy. Some senators shouted at the nominee, demanding that he answer questions about specific cases decided by the Supreme Court. Of course, the opponents didn't want a delay. They wanted to defeat the nomination, and they did, even though a majority of senators favored the nomination. A minority of senators defeated the nomination by a filibuster for a reason that had nothing to do with the nominee's qualifications. In the process, as they searched for ammunition to use against the nominee, they uncovered some financial dealings which ultimately led to his resignation from the Supreme Court. I cite this history to put the current issue into some perspective and to rebut the view, repeated so often in recent days, that controversy over Supreme Court nominees is a recent phenomenon. It is not. That does not justify the process in this or any other case. Just the opposite.
The fact that it's been going on for so long is more, not less reason to review the whole process. How can we responsibly consider those nominated by the President and do it in a way that is both perceived as and is in fact fair to our obligation under the Constitution, and fair to those involved in the process? We must confront and respond to that question in a way better than we have in the past. In 1980, the Republican National Convention adopted a platform which called for the appointment of judges committed to the pro-life position on abortion. Since 1980, in honoring that commitment, Presidents Reagan and Bush have established as a litmus test for a potential nominee to the Supreme Court that person's position on abortion. The President opposes a woman's right of choice. In order to have any hope of being nominated to the Supreme Court, so must any potential nominee. The President selects nominees because of their views, not despite them. That is his privilege. It is the reward of election to the presidency. He is answerable for the quality of his choices only to the voters and to history. But by the same token, the Senate is not required to be a rubber stamp to approve any nomination simply because it's been made by a president. It is illogical and untenable to suggest that the president has the right to select someone because of that person's views, and then to say that the Senate has no right to reject that person because of those very same views. President Bush has exercised his right to nominate a candidate for his views on abortion, even though the nominee refuses to discuss those views publicly. The president's current position on the issue of abortion is the minority view in the United States. A majority of Americans disagree with the president on abortion. So do a majority of senators. As a result, it is now widely believed that a nominee who agrees with the president on abortion and is willing to say so cannot be confirmed. So the president has sought candidates who agree with him on abortion, but whose views are not known, or who will deny having a view. With each nomination, the process has become more elaborate and less informative. For that reason and others, the confirmation process has become uncomfortable and demeaning for all concerned. It has taken on the trappings of a political campaign. Indeed, in the eyes of many Americans, the process has become confused with electoral politics. It must be changed. Recently, while I was in Maine, a woman came up to me and said with great emotion, "Please vote against Judge Thomas, because if he's confirmed, the right of choice will be lost." I told her that the right of choice was lost when George Bush was elected president. Judge Thomas will be confirmed and will soon be sitting on the Supreme Court. There he will vote to restrict the right of choice by women. But even if Judge Thomas were not to be confirmed by the Senate, there is no possibility that another nominee will have a different view on abortion. In the past, despite frequent political disagreement, presidents of both parties searched for excellence in making nominations to the Supreme Court. Not always, of course. The president sought nominees who combined excellence with views compatible with those of the president. The harsh reality now is that the politics of abortion dominate the filling of vacancies on the Supreme Court. That's sad, unfortunate, wrong for all concerned. Throughout the hearings, Judge Thomas repeatedly invoked his personal background of deprivation and segregation as a reason why he should be confirmed. Personal background and personal achievement undoubtedly say a great deal about character. They should be given great weight in the nomination process. But while invoking his early personal life as a reason for his confirmation, Judge Thomas repeatedly asked the committee to ignore much of what he said and wrote in the more than 10 years of his adult life in public service. He said that in preparing for service on the court, he would be like a runner stripping down for a race. He asks us to believe that his early experience shaped him, but that much of his recent experience left him untouched. Every nominee who comes to the Senate with a record will face questions about earlier statements and writings that may be inconsistent with more recent views. There's nothing unusual about that. The views of anyone in public life evolve, and statements made a decade ago may not reflect the current belief. But this is the first nominee I can recall who asked just the opposite, that we consider his early experience but ignore his recent views. We should consider his early experience. We should also consider his recent views. Mr. President, at this point in my statement, I cite several instances where Judge Thomas said or wrote one thing in recent years and had said something else at the hearings. Time doesn't permit me to read them all, so I ask unanimous consent that the full text of my statement be placed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
In summary, over and over again, Judge Thomas at his hearings denied, repudiated, abandoned his thoughts, his words, his views of the past decade. Over and over again, he now says that he didn't mean what he said. He didn't mean what he wrote in the 10 years he served both the Reagan and Bush administrations. So we're faced with a nominee who has an extensive public record, but who has run from that record. A nominee who asks the Senate to make a leap of faith that defies common sense and reason. Of all the things that have been said about the nominee, the least believable was President Bush's statement that race was not a factor at all in the nomination, and that Judge Thomas is the best qualified person in America to be on the Supreme Court. Both statements are obviously untrue. Race clearly was a factor in the nomination. That's no reason to reject it. Diversity on the court is desirable. And in an institution which so directly affects the lives...
Senator George Mitchell of Maine, who is the Senate Majority Leader, who is making the concluding speech here, as we're now about 5 or 6 minutes away from what will be the final vote on Clarence Thomas for his confirmation to the U.S. Supreme Court. We're now told by NBC's chief congressional correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, that he could end up with as many as 53 to 55 votes. But, of course, this is much more than a battle of mere numbers. There is a whole ideological battle that is in play here. There's a battle between Washington and the rest of the country. There's a battle between the process on the left and the right. There's a battle between the Congress and the White House. And this battle is by no means over, even when Clarence Thomas goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, as George Mitchell just now has confirmed that, in fact, he will. Senator Mitchell, in his final statement today, was framing it in terms of the coming debate on abortion, saying this is not a man who will allow the women of this country to have a choice on that very emotional issue. So we are, as I say, just moments away from the vote. NBC News will have continuing coverage. We'll remind you at this time that we have been here all day long. We will continue throughout this historic occasion. NBC News continuing its coverage of the debate to confirm Judge Clarence Thomas. States Senate, who has confirmed within the past few moments that now that the hour is here, Clarence Thomas does have the votes for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, the second black in the history of this country to hold that position, one of the most controversial appointees in the history of the court, made all the more dramatic in the closing days of his confirmation process when he was accused by a tenured law professor from the University of Oklahoma, Anita Hill, a former colleague, a black woman, of sexual harassment. Anita Hill went about her teaching duties today at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. She teaches contract and commercial law there, and she was in a, you can see, a good frame of mind, although she has not talked with reporters in any kind of detail since her testimony on Friday. She had a brief news conference yesterday expressing her gratitude to her friends and supporters back home in Oklahoma, and yet in the Senate vote today, it is likely that she did lose the Senate vote of Senator Boren, who's the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, even though many of his friends on the University of Oklahoma faculty lobbied him to vote against Clarence Thomas. It is expected tonight he will, in fact, vote for him. Back to George Mitchell now.
Where the workplace will finally be free of all discrimination, whether by race, by sex, or in any other form. Mr. President, I ask the members of the Senate to remain in their seats during the vote in accordance with the rules of the Senate. This is an important vote, and I ask that decorum be maintained. Mr. President, the ayes and nays in order. President, I request the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. Before the question is put to the Senate, the chair will remind the galleries that expressions of approval or disapproval are prohibited. The question is on the confirmation of the nomination of Clarence Thomas of Georgia to be an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The clerk will call the roll. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, this will be the last vote this evening. Under a unanimous consent agreement previously obtained, there will be a vote tomorrow on the veto override on the unemployment compensation bill and possibly other votes on appropriations conference reports. Those remain to be worked out. Thank my colleagues.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adams.
No.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Benson. Mr. Biden. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bond. Mr. Boren. Mr. Bradley. Mr. Breaux. Mr. Brown. Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bumpers. Mr. Burdick. Mr. Burns. Mr. Byrd. Mr. Chafee. Mr. Coates. Mr. Cochran.
Aye.
Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Conrad.
No.
Mr. Craig.
Aye.
Mr. Cranston. Mr. D'Amato. Mr. Danforth. Mr. Daschle. Mr. DeConcini. Mr. Dixon.
Aye.
Mr. Dodd.
No.
Mr. Dole. Mr. Domenici. Mr. Durenberger. Mr. Exon. Mr. Ford.
No.
Mr. Fowler. Mr. Garn. Mr. Glenn. Mr. Gore. Mr. Gorton. Mr. Graham of Florida.
No.
Mr. Graham of Texas. Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatfield. Mr. Heflin.
No.
Mr. Helms.
Aye.
Mr. Holling.
Aye.
Mr. Inouye.
No.
Mr. Jeffords.
Mr. Johnston.
Aye.
Mrs. Cassabaum. Mr. Caston. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Carey of Nebraska. Mr. Carey of Massachusetts. Mr. Cole. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lott. Mr. Lugar.
Aye.
Mr. Mack.
Aye.
Mr. McCain. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Metzenbaum.
No.
Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Moynihan. Mr. Murkowski. Mr. Nichols. Mr. Nunn. Mr. Packwood. Mr. Pell. Mr. Pressler.
Aye.
Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed. Mr. Regal. Mr. Robb.
Aye.
Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Roth. Mr. Rudman. Mr. Sanford.
No.
Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sasser. Mr. Seymour. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Simon. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Smith. Mr. Spector. Mr. Stevens. Mr. Sims. Mr. Thurman. Mr. Wallop. Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Mr. Wellstone. Mr. Worth. Mr. Wofford. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bond, Boren, Breaux, Brown, Burns, Chafee, Coates, Cochran, Cohen, Craig, D'Amato, Danforth, DeConcini, Dixon, Dole, Domenici, Durenberger, Exon, Fowler, Garn, Gorton, Graham of Texas, Grassley, Hatch, Hatfield, Helms, Hollings, Johnston, Cassabaum, Caston, Lott, Lugar, Mack, McCain, McConnell, Murkowski, Nichols, Nunn, Pressler, Robb, Roth, Rudman, Seymour, Shelby, Simpson, Smith, Spector, Stevens, Sims, Thurmond, Wallop, and Warner.
Glenn.
Going back over the list now.
Senators voting in the negative: Adams, Akaka, Baucus, Benson, Biden, Bingaman, Bradley, Bryan, Bumpers, Burdick, Byrd, Conrad, Cranston, Daschle, Dodd, Ford, Glenn, Gore, Graham of Florida, Heflin, Inouye, Jeffords, Kennedy, Kerry of Nebraska, Kerry of Massachusetts.
The mother of
Cole,
Clarence Thomas in Pinpoint, Georgia,
Leahy,
watching these
Levin,
proceedings.
Lieberman, Metzenbaum, Mikulski, Mitchell, Moynihan, Packwood, Pell, Pryor, Reed, Regal, Rockefeller, Sanford,
Leola
Sarbanes,
Williams.
Sasser, Simon, Wellstone, Worth, and Wofford. Mr. Harkin. No. Mr. Harkin, no.
Going back over the list now, picking up some other senators. That's Leola Williams, who's the mother of Clarence Thomas, watching as they await the confirmation of the vote. Now we go to Dan Quayle, the Vice President, for the announcement of the tally.
On this vote, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 48. The nomination of Clarence Thomas of Georgia to be Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court is hereby confirmed.
I move to reconsider the vote.
Without objection, the motion table is agreed to.
Mr. President, I suggest the
Proud moment in Pinpoint, Georgia, very obviously. A long, long road from that rural Georgia hamlet to the highest court in the land. A young black man who was sent off to live with his grandparents, educated in parochial schools, graduate of Holy Cross, Yale Law School. Now, with his proud mother and parents looking on, he can finally begin to realize the achievement of a dream, especially all that he has been through. But it is a moment of mixed emotion across the country because there were so many people who thought that Clarence Thomas did not belong on the U.S. Supreme Court. The country was as deeply divided as it has ever been by this process. All the last polls, of course, indicated that a majority of men and women, blacks and whites, were for his confirmation. But there is an embittered constituency out there who believe that Anita Hill was telling the truth. But for now, the moment belongs to Clarence Thomas. Well, that's the situation at this hour. This ordeal began more than 100 days ago when Clarence Thomas was nominated by President George Bush, who called him the best qualified man in the nation, said that his race had nothing to do with it, even though he was replacing the only other black on the court, Thurgood Marshall, who came up through an entirely different route and had an entirely different judicial philosophy, of course. Let's go to the White House now and NBC's John Cochran. John?
Well, the news will be very welcome here. The count of 52 to 48 may be a slight disappointment. I think they were hoping for something a bit higher than that, maybe 54, even 56 votes for Clarence Thomas. But the fact is he has won. They feel a lot better tonight, Tom, than they did last Friday evening. They thought things turned around 9:30 Eastern Time Friday night when Clarence Thomas started defending himself. Up till that point, I know at least 2 senior officials here in the White House thought the Thomas nomination was lost, Tom.
John Cochran, where do we go from here? We have been talking about this all day long. It seems to me that the country is in a state of intellectual and emotional, and I dare say physical exhaustion at this point. A lot of bitter feeling on both sides. The battle went right up to the final vote. What role does the president think that he can play in all of this as a healer, if any?
Well, if nothing else, I think the president feels he can keep a bad situation from getting worse. Therefore, you will not see the president making a lot of challenging statements toward the the Senate opponents of Clarence Thomas, or even these special interest groups, as the president refers to them. Instead, maybe the president will not take exactly a healing role in all of this, but he's not, as I say, he's not going to try to exacerbate the situation. And I do think when you talked about the exhaustion that the country feels, including moral exhaustion as well as mental and physical and all the rest, when I was talking to a senior official about 20 minutes ago, he said, "Thank God it's about to be over. I couldn't take much more of this." And I think he feels, the rest of the country feels that way, and the president feels that way. The president is going to low-key it tonight, we're told. He will speak by phone to Clarence Thomas. They may not meet again until Thomas is actually sworn in, Tom, which could be early next week. There are no plans to gloat, above all. No gloating from this White House. Relief that they won. Try to take the high road now. Enough people have taken the low road in the estimates of some of the president's advisors, possibly even some White House officials admitted they've been disappointed with some of the things that the White House has approved in this fight. That's over now. It's time, if not to heal, at least not to make the situation worse.
Does the president think that he'll have any entree into the wider black community as a result of what has happened here, John?
Well, you know, the president said Sunday afternoon when he returned from Camp David, he said, or Monday was it, he said that it's very important that a lot of black Americans sided with Clarence Thomas in the opinion polls taken around the country. Well, it was important for a tactical reason in this vote, because the feeling was that if a lot of blacks still back Clarence Thomas and not Anita Hill in this dispute, that Southern senators needing a lot of black votes in the states where the black vote was populous, that might just be enough to push them over into the Clarence Thomas column. Now we're past that, so what happens now? George Bush's relations with the black community have been pretty good until he became president. They felt good about him in the early days, but they've been disappointed. They've been very disappointed with his stand on the Civil Rights Bill. I do not detect that George Bush feels now he has to in some way heal his relations with the black community by going along with Senator John Danforth's compromise Civil Rights Bill. If anything, George Bush can say, he may not say it, but he'll hope that black Americans will say it for him, that he put a black on the Supreme Court. He backed him all the way when he was being attacked by liberals, and that there's really no reason why George Bush has to kowtow to the black community, Tom.
And let me ask you, John, about the president's own consciousness on this issue of sexual harassment. Was that changed at all by this acrimonious debate of the last 5 days?
Well, I am told simply that George Bush does not believe Anita Hill, that he really just thinks she was lying, very simply, but that he will never say that because he feels it accomplishes no purpose, and he certainly doesn't want to go out there and accuse a black woman or really almost anybody of actually lying. But I'm told he really does not believe her. And as far as the sexual harassment thing is concerned, I know that there are some people within the White House, and this is a minority that I've spoken to. There are a few people in senior positions in the White House who feel this is not a particularly sympathetic White House when it comes to the issue of sexual harassment, that this really is a male reservation here, and they have some very traditional attitudes. And the hope and I was speaking to a man at the time today, early today, a senior staffer, a male, who said, you know, this really is still an old boys club around here. We don't have an awful lot of women in senior positions. So maybe their eyes have been opened a bit. As we were talking over the weekend, Tom, I think that there are certainly a lot of people in men who are in managerial positions here who will certainly not get into any compromising positions with the women on their staff now.
All right, thank you very much, John Cochran at the White House. This is a moment of triumph, obviously, for Clarence Thomas, who grew up poor, grew up black in the Deep South, went to a Northeastern college, and then on to Yale Law School. Now he has achieved an elevation that he could not have dreamed of when he was a teenager, the United States Supreme Court. And he did that by defying the convention, really, of most of the major black groups in this country. And for that, they were not very happy with him. NBC's Andrea Mitchell is standing by. She's been watching all of this as well. Andrea, what about the healing process from the left to Judge Clarence Thomas now? Some very strong and embittering things were said about this man and how he arrived at where he did, including calling him, in effect, an Uncle Tom because he was only a pal of the right wing. Do you think that people will try to close ranks now and congratulate him in the spirit that he deserves?
I think that there will be some movement toward that, for no other than the grossly political reason that he is now an Associate Justice at the Supreme Court and has a great deal of power over the profound issues now dividing this country. So I think that there will be an effort to quiet down, at least by those who are not the most partisan people in this dispute. Those who are his strongest critics are very, very bitter about the way this entire matter was handled and feel that Anita Hill was really vilified in public, so they may be a little slower to try to heal those wounds.
All right, thank you, Andrea. We'll be getting back to you later in the evening, of course, as we continue our coverage. We want to go now to rural Georgia, to NBC's Rick Davis, who's there in Pinpoint with Clarence Thomas's mother.
When I was coming to Pinpoint,
Tom, if you can hear me here at the house of Abraham
you want
Campbell,
him to
Thomas
be.
is speaking now.
You let him be. Let him be. It's in your hands now.
Can you find it in your heart to forgive?
Oh, yes, I am. Yes, because I'm a Christian.
Yes.
I'm a
Yes.
Christian.
Yes.
And you cannot hate your
Right.
enemy.
Yes.
You got to love them as well as you do your friends.
Yes.
And all this talking that my son had done, he never criticized her once.
Right.
Never said
Never.
nothing about her
Never.
dad.
Never.
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 And that's a man.
Yeah.
Because he got a mother, he got sisters,
Yeah.
he got cousins
Yeah.
that are women.
Yeah.
And you don't talk about women.
Yeah.
And what did this do to you when you heard these statements made
It
about
hurt
your
me.
son?
It put me in bed.
Yes. Yes.
It put me in bed. I couldn't work because I knew it wasn't true. And I feel sorry. I feel sorry for our nation to could believe something like that
Yes.
on a good man. That child was was born in Pinpoint. He was raised up. He wasn't given away. I've heard one of the senators say today that I give my child away.
Yeah.
He was not given away.
No. No.
I didn't give my child away,
Never did.
and I never will.
What would you say to Anita Hill if you could talk to her?
I'll tell her to pray.
Yeah.
She need God bad.
Yeah. Tell her.
She need God bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the only man gonna help her.
Yeah.
Is God. I won't say nothing bad about her because I got a girl
Yeah.
and I got grandchildren, and I wouldn't say nothing about her bad. But she's a mother child too.
Yeah.
But whosoever put her up to do this, I pray God that she'll get her life straightened out. Pray God. She has hurt my child. But after all, he's a man. I just feel like that. In my heart, I feel like that because I don't think she could sit on TV and use those things and those words that she have used in that courtroom among all these people and then the worldwide that people could hear it. I don't think so. If my child had to say something like that, I'd have jumped up in that courtroom and boxed him in his mouth.
Yeah. Yeah. I believe it. Yeah. Yes, you would.
And if I couldn't get to him, I had her shoes on my foot. I throw it in his face.
There's been a lot of statements about your son perhaps not being the best choice. What do you think? What kind of justice do you think he'll make?
Somebody can say that, and that's God.
Yeah.
Men and women can talk all they want, but God got the last say so. And that man is going to show all of us and going to make all of them out of a liar.
Yeah.
All of them. All of them. I knew my God. I knew my God. My God sit high and look low. Oh, yes,
That's Leola Williams, who is the mother of Clarence Thomas, understandably very proud, a combination family celebration and Christian revival meeting there in Pinpoint, Georgia. This evening, as she watched on national television, first the ordeal of her son as he was accused by a former co-worker of sexual harassment in the most vivid possible terms, and now this moment of triumph for him as he goes to the United States Supreme Court, a lifetime appointment. NBC's Andrea Mitchell has been watching all of this as well. Andrea?
Well, certainly no one can deny the extraordinary personal history of Clarence Thomas coming from those very poor roots in Pinpoint, Georgia. And in fact, it was that personal story that carried him through the first set of hearings here. It was his declaration of his background and what it meant to him to be nominated to the Supreme Court that carried the day and, in fact, deflected questions about substance. As you know, he did not respond to many of the challenges from the committee on matters of his judicial philosophy. Tom?
Thank you, Andrea. We want to just take for a moment here in the closing moments of this part of our special coverage and review what we have been through as a nation. Clarence Thomas was well known within Washington circles and especially within the president's conservative political circles as an unusual black man because he defied, as I say, a lot of the beliefs of the majority black organizations in this country, the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, and a number of other organizations, because he has been critical in the past of affirmative action, among other things. He has said about the nation's civil rights leaders, all they do is whine, 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 and bitch, bitch, bitch. And then finally, on Friday night when he appeared, he said he is the victim of an electronic lynching because he is an uppity black man. He felt that he had been unfairly criticized and excoriated for taking this unconventional point of view. But tonight, the U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justiceship belongs to him. It will be with him for the rest of his life. He's only 43 years of age. As some people have put it, the next president of the United States who will replace him is now only 15 years of age. He could go into the third decade of the next century. But he has endured this ordeal. He has won confirmation with 52 votes in the United States Senate. And NBC News will have continuing coverage of all of this in just a few moments.
NBC Saturday starts with all new Golden Girls.
Fabricon Carousel Company of New York
is hereby confirmed.
I move to reconsider the vote.
Move to lay that on the table.
Clarence Thomas wins the battle. The Senate puts him on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Minister.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight, Judge Thomas, the final vote. Now reporting from the Capitol in Washington, here is Tom Brokaw.
Well, this part of the ordeal, at least, is over. 106 days after a little-known federal appeals court judge was invited to Kennebunkport, Maine, and offered the chance to shape the nation's history, Clarence Thomas was confirmed tonight to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a beginning and an end, the beginning of a new era on the court, the end of one of the most wrenching political battles that this country has ever endured. The final vote in the Senate tonight was 52 to 48. NBC's chief congressional correspondent is Andrea Mitchell. She was watching all of this. Andrea?
Tom, even though Republicans knew they had won, today's debate was angry and at times personal.
Give to the Senate righteous wisdom as it comes to the moment of judgment today.
The Senate has not had much righteous wisdom lately. Today was no different. The bitterness of the hearing spilled over onto the Senate floor.
There is no proof at all that Anita Hill is fantasizing these charges or is mentally unbalanced. And shame on anyone desperate enough to suggest that she is. The treatment of Anita Hill is what every woman fears who thinks of lifting the veil and revealing her sexual harassment.
We do not need characterizations like shame in this chamber from the senator from Massachusetts.
I reiterate to the senator from Pennsylvania and to others that the way that Professor Hill was treated was shameful,
All I can say is that a very good man who many of us know personally has been seriously damaged by these allegations by one woman, unsubstantiated allegations that nobody else who worked with him on a continuing and lengthy basis believes.
Thomas's victory was assured as undecided Democrats began declaring their support, some grudgingly.
I was surprised and disappointed at many of his statements. Notwithstanding my reservations as to the nominee, I intend to vote for confirmation, but without enthusiasm.
Since both were credible, however, and since it is impossible to get to the bottom of this matter, I think we have to fall back on our legal system and its presumption of innocence for those accused.
The sex harassment charge did persuade Byrd of West Virginia, a Thomas supporter last week, to change his mind.
I believe Anita Hill. I believe what she said. I did not see on that face the knotted brow of satanic revenge. I was offended by Judge Thomas's stonewalling the committee. And I frankly was offended by his injection of racism into these hearings. There was a diversionary tactic intended to divert both the committee's and the American public's attention away from the issue at hand, the issue being which one is telling the truth.
On the Senate floor, Anita Hill got the kind of support she had failed to get during the Judiciary Committee hearings.
The treatment that the men in the White House gave to Professor Hill illustrates better than 1,000 psychological studies why women are reluctant to step forward.
Maybe she was deluded into the fact that if she came forth and was a good citizen, she would be protected. Maybe she had fantasies about the fairness of a process she thought she would get in the United States Senate.
To say, but there must be something wrong. She sounds credible. I cannot poke a hole in her story. So there must be something wrong. If that's not stereotypical treatment, I don't know what is. Black women have been in the short end of that for centuries.
Finally, it was over with closing arguments from both sides.
With each nomination, the process has become more elaborate and less informative. For that reason and others, the confirmation process has become uncomfortable and demeaning for all concerned.
And will it have a lasting impact when he reviews various kinds of cases, including cases of sexual harassment? Mr. President, in my view, this will make Judge Thomas even a better judge, a stronger judge than earlier indicated. Having gone through another test of his strength and his character, in my view, he's in a stronger position.
This chapter may not be over. The Senate still has to confront its own problems, and there is a lot of blood on the Senate floor. Tom?
Thank you, Andrea. Well, many communities in America were divided over the nomination and the confirmation of Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court. One community in rural Georgia definitely was not. Pinpoint, Georgia, his hometown. Rick Davis is there tonight with Leola Williams, Clarence Thomas's mother. Rick?
Tom, we're at the home of Abraham Famble here in Pinpoint. He's standing right behind Leola Williams, the mother of Clarence Thomas. Ms. Thomas, Ms. Williams, how's it feel to be the mother of Supreme Court Justice?
Feel good. It feels good.
Did you ever have any doubts?
No.
When you heard all those terrible things about your son, what did it do to you?
It hurt me very much, but I prayed.
You prayed a lot this afternoon, too.
Oh, yes, I did. Yes, I did. And I prayed the whole time because I knew God is able.
Now, some people have said that your son isn't qualified. What do you think?
You know, I'll tell you what my dad said one time. Sticks and stone may break my bone, but words will never harm me.
Yes. That's it.
He talk about him, but that's all right.
That's all right.
They talk about Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
What words would you have for Anita Hill after what you heard her say?
I asked him to pray. She need to pray. She need to pray.
Is there anger in your heart now?
No. It wasn't anger then. I was just upset, but I wasn't angry because that is a mother's daughter.
Ms. Williams, thank you very much for being with us. It's been a trying afternoon for you. Thank you. Tom?
Thank you very much, Rick Davis, in Pinpoint, Georgia tonight. By the way, Ms. Williams said earlier that she thought someone had put words in Anita Hill's mouth. There's absolutely no indication that that was the case. She has always said those were her charges only. We'll be back with Orrin Hatch right after this.
You've been up in the air for hours. Now you've got to make up the time. Aren't you glad Hertz has a faster, easier way to rent a car? #1 Club Gold. No paperwork, no stopping at counters, nothing to slow you down. You go straight to our Gold parking area, where your car is waiting, ready to go. It's our fastest way to rent a car.
I'm gonna make it.
Call Hertz today for low daily rates on Lincolns with free unlimited mileage.
We're America's wheels.
By noon, her fever was climbing, and now she has...
Toughest man in America to have been able to have everything but the kitchen sink thrown at him, and yet he's come from poverty right to the highest position in the land in the judiciary, and I just want to congratulate him and tell him how proud I am of him.
Senator Hatch, there was a lot of vitriol on both sides. This nation, well, not absolutely equally divided, has been torn apart in the past several days. Do you think that it is time for some kind of a healing process, and what do you think your role in that may be?
Well, I do. I think that, you know, now that the battle's over, he is going to be the second African-American on the Supreme Court. I'm so doggone proud of him. He's a great, great human being. But I think all of us have got to put aside the past and now go on to the future, support him, and help him to let him know that this is what America's all about. When a person can rise from where he was to where he is now, I think all of America should feel good about this, and certainly I know all my African-American friends are just overjoyed.
Indisputably, he is a man of extraordinary achievement, but I wonder on reflection, when you think back on some of the things that you had to say about Anita Hill in the heat of the battle the other day, if you have any regrets whatsoever.
Well, I've always been quite nice to her. I've always said that I've never allowed anybody around me to call her a prevaricator or a liar. I've always said that she believes what she's saying. I think she's been badly used, but be that as it may, I wish her well. I hope that she continues to be a good law professor, and I hope she has a good life from this point on. But really, I have to tell you, I thought there were tremendous holes in the story that was put forth.
And what about the role of sexual harassment in America in the future, Senator?
You know, I think all of us from this experience have to become much more sensitive to this issue. And I think everybody I've met here in the Senate, in my home state of Utah, everybody is becoming much more concerned about this terrible thing. I've got 3 daughters and 9 granddaughters, 3 sons and 3 grandsons, and I don't want them to ever have to face anything like was described here or has been told me by so many women throughout the last couple of weeks. I think it's been a healthy thing over the long run, and, even though I think it's terrible that Clarence Thomas had to go through this. I think it's terrible that Anita Hill had to go through this as well. Could have all been avoided had the process been fair. It was not fair.
Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican of Utah, thanks very much for being with us tonight.
Nice to be with you.
Let's go now to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. NBC John Cochran is standing by there tonight. This is a big political win for President Bush as well. John?
It sure is, Tom. The president watched the vote in the Senate on television. He watched it here in the White House. Then he picked up the phone. Mrs. Bush was at his side, and he called Clarence Thomas at his home over in Virginia. The president said, "Congratulations, you've done a fine job. You've been an unbelievable inspiration to the American people, and you have a lifetime of service to the country ahead." Mrs. Bush also got on the phone and congratulated Judge Thomas. Now, the White House also issued a written statement from the President's press secretary, Marlin Fitzroy. I'll read just a little bit of it, but it's notable because it's not notable. There's nothing in here that is controversial. For example, the nation and the court benefit from having a man of principle who is sensitive to the problems and opportunities facing all Americans. Well, maybe Anita Hill supporters could certainly say that that's somewhat controversial. But the idea here is to low-key all this, to make no more enemies. The president has got 2 big fights right ahead of him. He's got the civil rights debate coming up. The president will take on Senator John Danforth, Clarence Thomas's ally in the Senate on that. That could be a very close vote. And beyond that, you've got the Bob Gates nomination. Bob Gates being nominated by the president to be director of the CIA. That could be very close. That was expected to be quite nasty. It couldn't possibly be as nasty as the Clarence Thomas nomination, but it could certainly be close, Tom.
Thank you very much. John Cochran at the White House tonight. The president knew last night that he probably had the votes, went out and celebrated. Didn't feel that it was necessary to do anything exceptional tonight. Now let's go to Chicago. NBC's Mike Betcher is standing by there. Mike, I can't remember an issue, I guess since the closing days of Watergate, that has at once so electrified and divided and in many ways torn this country apart. What are they saying tonight in Chicago, where you are in what, a health club, I guess?
Well, yes, we're at the health club, the East Bank Club in Chicago, and like millions of other Americans, people here have tried to catch a glimpse of the Senate hearing today. Over the past 5 days, Americans all over the country have tried to work in these hearings into their work and into their play, and so it is here at the East Bank Club. We're speaking with Nancy Knoll, who is a stockbroker here in Chicago, correct?
Correct, financial broker.
What did you think about the entire process as it unfolded over the past 5 days?
Well, I think that anybody who had their life put on national television would be a little bit upset, but since we are voting on a judge that will rule the American public, I think it was good to put it on the air and try to get all the claims out. And unfortunately, there was no conclusive evidence. So with hindsight, I suppose to some people it looks like it could have been a waste of time, but with the foresight, hopefully it will, for the future, have some democratic pattern for us to follow.
Okay, thank you very much. Over here is Simon Porter, who's a retired judge, knows something about these sorts of affairs. Mr. Porter, how did you view this entire process? A lot of people we spoke to said they thought it was a circus, and they were angry at their representatives, their senators.
They have to go through the process. They have to be able to interview the individual and find out. And I think what we have here now is a man who has been confirmed. Let's get behind him. Let him be on the bench. He'll certainly be sensitive to women's problems, more sensitive than anybody else on the bench. He's there for life. He got what he wants. She'll wind up with a book or a movie. She'll have something out of it. I think they both were credible. They both may have misinterpreted what the other thought. And I feel that he'll do a good job.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Well, Americans want to get on with it now after these hearings for 5 days. They want to get on with their lives, Tom.
Thank you very much, Mike Betcher. That, too, is a commentary on America. If you want to find a lot of people these days, you don't go to the sidewalks of Chicago. You go into a health club where you find a woman stockbroker with a T-shirt from Bangkok on a treadmill being interviewed about a Supreme Court nominee. We'll be back with more after this.
It's 6 o'clock. You're coming home for supper tonight. You worked all day. You wake up and appetite.
Hey, Mom, what's for dinner?
For their parties are with us now, Arlen Specter, Republican of Pennsylvania, who had a kind of prosecutorial style. He's on your right. And Pat Leahy on the left, who did a lot of the questioning for the Democrats. Senator Specter, let me begin with you. You had a rather sharp exchange today with Senator Kennedy of Massachusetts. He accused your side of the shameful treatment of Anita Hill. Then you responded by saying that let not the senator from Massachusetts talk about shame on this Senate chamber. Did the normal rules of personal politeness get breached today?
Well, Tom, sometimes it gets a little hot. You know, we're all pretty extended here. It's been a very tough week for everybody, and sometimes tempers do flare a little, but we try to keep it in check.
What do you think will happen in the Senate after this very bitter, very dividing vote now?
Well, Tom, we've got to come together. I heard you talking earlier to Orrin about the healing process. We have to do that not only within the Senate, but for everybody. It's been a very tough experience for Judge Thomas. I congratulate him, but I know that it's been a very tough experience for Anita Hill. And nobody liked to go through the process. But if you're given a job, finding the facts, trying to make a judgment, you have to ask questions. And I just hope we can put it all behind us and come together.
Senator Leahy, a lot of nonpartisan people say that, listen, the Democrats simply cannot accept the idea that a president of the United States, a Republican, can nominate somebody with whom he is philosophically compatible. They have to go out and do everything that they can to bring that person down.
I don't accept that. I mean, the fact is that the Supreme Court nomination is for the whole country. It's not just for the Republican Party, not just for the Democratic Party. In fact, if there's any advice to give to Judge Thomas, now Justice Thomas, would be, remember, your duty is to the whole country, not to just one ideological part of one national party.
Senator Specter, a lot of people remember that you were a key factor in the defeat of Robert Bork when he came before this body 4 years ago. Do you really think that Clarence Thomas is a better qualified legal mind than Robert Bork to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court?
I think that Judge Bork could have been a great justice, but he could have been as I said at the time, not good at all because of his very, very different views of original intent. You know, it's an interesting thing, Tom. When you're with somebody, everybody on one side loves you if you're against Judge Bork, and if you take a stand and come down to be for Judge Thomas, people are very much opposed to you. But They're very different men. And I think that Professor Drew Days of Yale Law School, who was opposed to Judge Thomas, put it best when he said that he was intellectually and educationally qualified. Judge Bork was a brilliant man, but his views of original intent were very, very dangerous for the Constitution, in my opinion.
And Senator Leahy, let me ask you, this became a kind of national referendum, if you will, and the Democrats, once again, when they went to the entire country, lost. That does not bode very well for you, does it, for 92?
No, what we have is a nominee that when the president nominated him, they were confidently expecting about 80 votes. They ended up with 52 votes. That is not a ringing, clear majority for anybody in that. It required all kinds of arm twisting. I read at the last minute the vice president was in the chair expecting there may be a tie vote. Nobody got a ringing mandate out of this. Now it's up to Judge Thomas to really do the most to heal everybody by demonstrating when he goes on the Supreme Court he's there for all Americans, not just for one party or the other.
Senator Leahy, Senator Spector, thank you both very much. I know that you're normally men of high energy, but you look a little exhausted tonight.
There hasn't been much sleep.
That's understandable.
I'll say yes, we are tired.
Yeah, it's a condition that a lot of us share, by the way. When we continue, the issues raised in this battle, a prominent lawyer will help us look at the effects of these issues on the courts and at work. Seen what happened to Anita Hill, will not come forward now with charges of sexual harassment?
Well, Tom, I would say this. I think there are some aspects of the hearing over the weekend that would give women pause about coming forward. But I do also think that each case stands on its own facts.
Isn't part of the problem that we really don't know in a kind of statutory sense just what sexual harassment is?
Well, I think that there is some concern about that. And certainly, Tom, you know, it's an area that has just recently come into the public spotlight, has been recognized, I think, by the public really only in the last 5 years or so, since the Supreme Court spoke in the Vinson case.
Given the crowded conditions of the nation's courtrooms already, wouldn't it be better for corporations and institutions, for that matter, to develop in-house procedures to deal with all of this?
Well, I can certainly tell you that I'm sure there is no employer aware in this country who has looked at these hearings and has not thought we'd best get a good written sexual harassment policy on the books. And I believe that that's very good advice indeed. And also I think an investigation procedure, a good complaint procedure, all of these are things that can go a long way toward insulating employers from liability in situations such as this.
But even if you do all of that, given the vagueness of it all, isn't there a good possibility that you could still end up in court?
Well, certainly suits can be brought, but in this particular instance, I think you can really see how difficult it is for a woman who would have to endure the kind of questioning that Anita Hill had to endure over this weekend. Certainly an area where the man portrays himself as a victim and where the woman is really attacked as if she were on trial. So these are not necessarily easy cases for women to bring.
Thank you very much, Louise Lamothe of Los Angeles tonight. Back in a moment with some final thoughts.
It's 6 o'clock, you're coming home for supper tonight. You work all day, you wake up and...
Associate Justice. I'm Tom Brokaw in Washington. In some areas of the country, we will have continuing coverage. In any event, we'll be back after your local news tonight for special coverage of this historic day. See you then.
Our telecommunications strategy needed some serious rethinking. User demand on our 9.6s was outrunning bandwidth, and we had way too much contention for analog line time. New York Telephone took...
Good evening and welcome to Cross